Thank you all for joining us today for what we expect to be a lively discussion. I'm Sheila Krumholtz, the Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Politics, which you may know better as opensecrets.org. Our topic, broadly speaking, is the evolving landscape in campaign finance, the important issues that have been raised, starting with Citizens United and continuing as this campaign has developed. The money spent by outside groups to shape the upcoming election, and specifically the role of 501c nonprofits. The 2012 election season has been defined by a series of court decisions from 2010 up through last week's Fourth Circuit decision in RTAO versus FEC, and the way campaigns and outside groups have reacted to them. CRP has kept an eye trained on the outside money for as long as I can remember, but it was careful, careful review of IRS reports by researcher Robert McGuire that led us beyond super PACs to our current effort to track as many of the contributions to political nonprofits as we can. This work resulted in several articles that are part of an ongoing series called The Shadow Money Trail. The latest article, published yesterday and included in your folder, details the intricate web of money that libertarian funder Howard Rich has woven over years and among many organizations. Also, please note the article entitled Nonprofits Outspent Super PACs in 2010. Where's Michael? A joint effort by CRP and the Center for Public Integrity, also in your folders. Author Michael Beckel is with us today. Finally, following our keynote today, Kathleen Hall-Jamieson of the Annenberg Public Policy Center will present yet another joint analysis with CRP. So lots of collaborations in the works. There has been such a wealth of must-read information this year, thoughtful, informative, and controversial news articles, essays, opinion pieces, and data analysis, that it's a wonder that reporters still meet deadlines, classes still get taught, and hours are left to be billed. We're fortunate to have some of those who produce this work on all sides of the issue here with us today. I should note that we did invite the IRS, but they did not make anyone available to attend. As everyone here knows, this is what we're all seeing and soon we'll see more of. Huge sums of money, both raised and spent, greatly increased from prior cycles, spent earlier. Campaigns begin earlier because the spenders see benefit to remaining under the radar for which early spending provides. The honor system. Spending on electioneering allows messages indistinguishable from independent expenditures to viewers at home, but carefully weighed and counted by tax lawyers whose clients may choose to count this spending as meeting their educational or social welfare goals. Hidden money, both raised and spent, from any source, including directly from corporate trade association and union treasuries, without limits, directly engaging in electioneering and electoral advocacy, non-coordinated coordination, where the rules have become so complex and precise and arguably divorced from reality. Conservative and progressive nonprofits alike see a big need to protect the anonymity of their donors. Conservatives see the need to protect from perceived consequences of disclosure, including intimidation and retribution. That is, that disclosure is not totally benign. Progressives see corporate puppeteers pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Reformers see comprehensive disclosure as the last line of defense against those behind-the-scenes machinations. We may view the impact differently, but there are important new elements of the process. The question is, what happens next? Maybe a new chapter in the ebb and flow of restrictions on fundraising and spending in elections. All of this really centers on fundamental elements of democracy, protecting freedom of speech versus protecting the democratic system from corruption. The need to be able to freely and loudly complain about the government versus the danger that huge financial resources dumped into the electoral process jeopardizes the principle of one person, one vote. We're all equal, but only if the range of possibilities is not reduced and the probabilities of success are not distorted in some important way by these extraordinary sums of money. There are all kinds of ways these vast sums can distort the democratic process. What selective benefits do donors get when they pony up in this system? Stopping all of the money may also have a distorted effect. Principally, many argue, the censorship of speech and ideas. At any rate, it looks as though there's no limit to the money in this cycle, and the ads it has brought are coming in a barrage. Let's take a look at a couple now.
The objective was to make money. Whether the companies they came in and worked with made money or not was irrelevant. Bain Capital always made money. If we lost, they made money. If we survived, they made money. It's as simple as that. He promised us the same things he's promised in the United States. He'll give you the same thing he gave us. Nothing. He'll take it all.
Priorities USA Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
I always loved watching the kids play basketball. I still do, even though things have changed. It's funny, they can't find jobs to get their careers started, and I can't afford to retire. And now we're all living together again. I supported President Obama because he spoke so beautifully. He promised change, but things changed for the worse. Obama started spending like our credit cards have no limit. His healthcare law made health insurance even more expensive. We've had stimulus and bailouts. Obama added almost $16,000 in debt for every American. How will my kids pay that off when they can't even find jobs? Now Obama wants more spending and taxes. That won't fix things. I had so many hopes. Cutting taxes and debt and creating jobs. That's the change we need. Tell President Obama to cut the job-killing debt and support the New Majority Agenda at newmajorityagenda.org.
So for one of these ads, we know where the money came from and how it was spent. For the other, we know nothing. We know neither who put up the money nor anything about the spending itself. There are nuanced differences about these groups and their ads that the spender hopes are lost on the audience, but that have important differences in the context of disclosure. If the goal is to have the same thing treated the same way, then the current regulatory scheme fails because IEs, independent expenditures, and electioneering communications are in many ways treated the same, but they're not the same. I have two announcements before we begin with our first panel. First, we're recording the conference, so during the Q&A period, please identify yourself and your organization before asking questions. And for the tweeters among us, we're using the hashtag #ShadowMoney. And now, CRP and editorial and communications director Viveka Novak will introduce our first moderator.
Our first panel will focus on the tax issues, the controversial tax issues swirling around these groups doing the kind of spending that we're seeing so much of and for which we don't know where the money comes from. Our first panel will be moderated by Ken Doyle, who's been a reporter and editor at BNA, now Bloomberg BNA, for more than 25 years. Since 1998, he's been the senior editor for BNA Money and Politics Report, a daily news service that he conceived and developed. Anyone who follows these issues in town knows that Ken is the dean of reporters, the one to read, covering campaign finance, lobbying, government ethics in Congress, the courts, and federal agencies. So Ken will introduce the rest of our first panel.
On. I'm going to do a little brief intro and introduce the panelists, and then each of the panelists is going to make some brief remarks, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I want to thank the Center for Responsive Politics for holding this important event today and for inviting me to be part of it. One of the great things about being a reporter is that I get to ask questions. I don't have to act like I already know everything. This is especially important with this complex subject that's getting so much attention in this election season: tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, often known as 501c4 groups, that get involved in politics. There's a lot of confusion about these groups and the distinction between them and so-called super PACs. It gets worse because some super PACs, such as American Crossroads and Priorities USA, are linked to 501c4 groups that seem to be doing exactly the same kinds of things as super PACs, mainly sponsoring TV ads that praise or attack candidates. The only difference apparent to many of us is that super PACs disclose their donors and 501c4 groups don't. True super PACs are PACs, political action committees that register and report detailed financial information, including their contributors, to the Federal Election Commission. Because of recent court decisions, including the 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus FEC, super PACs and other groups can take unlimited contributions, including corporate and union money, to pay for independent expenditures, campaign expenditures. But super PACs still follow the same detailed reporting rules as traditional PACs. 501c4 groups do not follow the same FEC disclosure requirements, although they sometimes have to file reports with the FEC regarding specific spending activities, such as independent expenditures and electioneering communications, which are legally defined terms. They generally do not disclose any of their donors to the FEC, although there is ongoing litigation initiated by Congressman Van Hollen regarding whether some donor disclosure is required. The 501c4 groups do have to follow tax laws and Internal Revenue Service rules regarding the type of activities, including political activities, that they are allowed to do and still retain their tax-exempt status. The main IRS rule is that these groups cannot have politics as their, quote, primary purpose, unquote, whatever that means. This is the murky area where our panel hopes to shine some light. These experts may not have all the answers, but if they don't, probably no one does. Mark Owens will talk about the different types of organizations existing under the tax laws and characteristics of each category and the IRS audit process, including recent developments that may be significant. Heidi Abeg will talk about how sponsors and donors decide to organize themselves, including such decisions as whether to apply for tax-exempt status. And Fran Hill will talk about the larger picture, whether organizations operating today across the political and ideological spectrum are fulfilling the purpose intended by laws that provide tax benefits to entities that operate for the, quote, social welfare, unquote, as opposed to private gain. I'll introduce the panelists now, and then they'll make their remarks. Heidi Abeg is senior counsel with the firm Webster, Chamberlain, and Bean. She represents nonprofit organizations, including charities, social welfare organizations, professional societies, trade associations, political committees, and candidates. She advises clients on all areas of business, transactional and tax law, as well as campaign finance, lobbying, and ethics and privacy issues. She's litigated campaign finance cases before state Supreme Courts and several federal circuit courts, and has authored articles in this area. Frances R. Hill is a professor of law and a Dean's Distinguished Scholar for the profession at the University of Miami Law School, where she teaches and writes on tax, constitutional law, and election law. Professor Hill is the co-author of Taxation of Exempt Organizations, widely used treatise, and she's testified before committees of the U.S. Congress and the FEC. Marcus Owens is a member of the Washington, D.C. law firm Kaplan and Drysdale, where he specializes in federal tax issues relating to tax-exempt organizations, including charities and issue advocacy groups. Previously, he spent 25 years with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. For 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, he served as director of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division. In that position, Owens oversaw the design and implementation of federal tax rulings and enforcement programs for charities and other tax-exempt organizations. And we'll start with Mark.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to the Center for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm going to take just a few minutes to lay out a basic overview of the different types of tax-exempt organizations that are involved in political activities, and something about the distinctions between the different types, both in the type of activities in which they can engage and in the nature and timing of various federal filings that they have to make. And so to start off, there are at least 4 significant different types of tax-exempt organizations involved in the political sphere, 5 if we count labor unions. The organizations are first of those exempt under Section 501c3. Those are commonly known as charities. Those organizations are precluded from engaging in political campaign activity, and any lobbying activity they undertake is fairly narrowly limited by the Internal Revenue Code. In order to be exempt, Section 501c3 organizations have to file an application for exemption within 27 months of the date of formation, and they're subject to an annual requirement of filing a Form 990, which is a publicly available information return that to which is attached a list of donors, but the donor list is not made public by the Internal Revenue Service. In addition to charities, a significant number of Section 501c4 organizations are involved in public policy now, including campaign activity. Section 501c4 provides for tax-exempt status for organizations that further social welfare, which the IRS has traditionally defined as something akin to charity, but a broader concept, and a broader concept that can include, for example, lobbying activities. So a 501c4 organization could be formed for the sole purpose of lobbying Congress or state legislators, or the public for that matter, on particular issues. Section 501c4 organizations cannot be operated for, they must be operated for this public purpose of advancing social welfare as distinct from a more narrow or private purpose. Section 501c4 organizations are not required to file an application for exemption. However, if they want affirmation that they are exempt, and in order to avoid difficulties in dealing with the IRS Service Center when they file their annual Form 990, which they are required to file, many 501c4s do elect to file an application for exemption, and Heidi will go into some of the nuances of that. Section 501c4 organizations are also required to disclose their donors to the IRS, but that donor list is not a public document. Now, in addition to C3s and C4s, and incidentally, the Internal Revenue Code has 29 different categories, but I'm not going to go through all of them today. You have Section 501c6 trade associations and Section 501c5 labor unions. Labor unions and trade associations advance the interests of their members rather than a broader public interest. In the trade association case, it's the line of business represented by the membership. In a labor union case, it's the members of the labor union. Both trade associations and labor unions and 501c4s are allowed by the tax law to engage in a limited amount of campaign activity, that is political campaign activity, traditional electioneering. The standard for all 3 is the one that was just enunciated. That is, the primary activity of the C4, C5, or C6 has to be either advancing social welfare in the case of a C4, advancing the interests of the members of the labor union if it's a C5, or advancing the interests of the line of business if it's a C6. But in that context, the organizations can engage in some amount of political campaign activity and can, of course, become involved in lobbying and the public policy debate, if you will, without restriction, as long as there's a nexus to their overall exempt purpose. A trade association, for example, made up of a particular line of business would not find it appropriate to lobby on behalf of some other industry. In other words, they're bounded by the nature of their members. And labor unions are going to be, their activities are going to have a nexus to advancing the interests of the worker members. Now, in addition to those categories of tax-exempt organizations, you have Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code, which provides for tax exemption, at least a form of tax exemption, for political organizations, including political parties, candidate committees, independent committees, organizations whose purpose is to engage in the political process, to advance or oppose candidates for elected public office, whether at the federal or state level, or the local level for that matter. Now, all the tax-exempt organizations that are described in 501c, that is 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, must file a Form 990. The application for exemption is more optional for the 4s, 5s, and 6s. Section 527 organizations have a different filing arrangement. They have to notify the Internal Revenue Service within 24 hours of their formation by filing a Form 8871, and then they must report on donors with a Form 8872 that's filed periodically, either a quarterly or monthly basis, that discloses the names of the donors. Those names are made public. As an alternative, if they're required to file that same information with a state election commission, they can satisfy their federal filing requirement that way. The bottom line is Section 527 organizations are exempt on their politically connected income, and there's a heightened degree of visibility of their activities and their donors. The 501c organizations have a level of visibility of their finances through the Form 990, but their donors are not public. And the ability to engage in lobbying and political activity varies in degree among those different organizations. So that's in a nutshell, the tax law structure we're dealing with.
Well, I'm going to provide some background information regarding the application process and the enforcement of activities of 501c4 organizations. Form 1024 is used by most 501c types to apply for recognition of exemption. And as Mark said, Section 501c4 organizations are not required to file Form 1024, unlike Section 501c3 organizations, in order to be tax exempt. They may wish to receive a determination letter of IRS recognition of their 501c3 or 501c status for several reasons. One is the public recognition of tax exempt status. The second reason is provides automatic or at least easier exemption from state and local income and sales taxes if they have that recognition. Another common reason is to provide advance assurance to donors because in some cases contributions may be deductible as a business expense. The fourth most common reason is if a postal permit is desired. There are still nonprofits that have very successful direct mail campaigns, and so it's advantageous for those organizations to mail at a reduced postal rate. And the United States Postal Service requires that exemption letter from the IRS. And the last reason is for some organizations, if they're unsure whether they qualify, they might want the IRS to recognize them so there's not an issue later on. There are also legitimate reasons why some Section 501c4 organizations don't file their 1024 application. Preparing the 1024 application and receiving the recognition is time-consuming, and it can be expensive, especially for small organizations. In some cases, the lag time can be over a year. So some Section 501c4 organizations, such as ballot measure committees, referendum committees, are not even in existence long enough to receive that recognition, so they simply don't apply. This length of time to obtain the recognition raises another point The lag time has contributed to, quote, the buying of existing 501c4 organizations which have already received their determination letters. If a group buys or takes over an existing organization, no new application is required. All that is required is to notify the IRS of the name change, if there is one, and or the change in the manner of operation, all of which can be done on Form 990. Whether the buying of organizations and or disclosing material changes only on Form 990 should be permissible has been subject to some debate. Turning to enforcement and odds of intervention, there are many differences between IRS and FEC enforcement. A private party cannot sue organizations to challenge their exempt status. Their only option is to file a complaint with the IRS, and they have no standing to force the IRS to take action on such complaints, and sometimes may never even know if the IRS takes any action. Only directly affected taxpayers have standing to challenge regulations or enforcement actions. A third party generally doesn't have standing to challenge the IRS's decision to grant exempt status. But by contrast, the FEC must resolve in some manner every legitimate complaint that is filed. The results of these actions are made public, and the party who filed the complaint has the ability to challenge the FEC's result in court. Another difference between the IRS and the FEC is the fairly low IRS audit rates. The IRS has a less than 1% audit rate of nonprofit organizations, whereas it's generally believed that the FEC, through its analysts, reviews every piece of paper that is filed. Another difference is the process itself. The IRS enforcement takes place in secret due to the provisions in the tax code which prohibits the IRS from disclosing information about an audit. Thus, the public's unaware of any of this unless the organization's exempt status is revoked, the IRS issues a redacted letter ruling, or the organization itself discloses the results. The FEC, however, is required to address every complaint, and once the matter has been concluded, the results are placed on the public record. Therefore, in the FEC context, you have very helpful precedent that is not always present on the tax side. Another difference between the two agencies is when the investigation may occur. The FEC can investigate communications at any time and can and has investigated single communications. However, the IRS usually waits until a tax return is filed because when the IRS does look at primary purpose, it is looking at least a 1-year time period. So if you couple this with the 2-3-month extensions organizations may receive to file their tax returns, you can see the long lag time that may occur between activity and the commencement of an IRS audit. An IRS audit may not start until almost 2 years after the activity has occurred. And as long as the organization is primarily engaged in social welfare, a communication that contains campaign intervention will not jeopardize its exempt status, although it may subject it to tax under Section 527. The FEC has the ability to impose fines and penalties, whereas the IRS may charge taxes or revoke exempt status. So all of these differences create uncertainties into how Section 501c4 organizations operate.
I should note, as a footnote to Heidi's discussion of IRS audit activity, each year the IRS releases publicly its work plan, which is a list of the issues that it's going to pursue in its audits in the next fiscal year. And the work plan governing this fiscal year, the one we're in now, calls for a review of Section 501c4 organizations for, among other things, political activity. So the IRS has publicly announced that they will be looking at some subset of organizations exempt under Section 501c4, starting this fiscal year and presumably moving into next fiscal year as well.
Thank you. I want to make 3 points today about Section 501c4 organizations, which are barely addressed beyond putting them on a sort of box chart with C3s and C6s to compare what we think they can do in politics and lobbying. And there is a great deal more to it than that. And my first and most important point is we cannot understand the approach to advocacy activities of C4s unless we understand C4s as exempt entities. Why are these things in the code at all, and what do they do, and what are they supposed to do? And if we look at the regulations, and I realize I'm getting really very hardcore taxy now, but this is the tax panel, so hold on. If we actually read the regulations, we find out that a 501c4 organization is supposed to exist primarily for promoting the social welfare of the people of the community. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? I imagine parks and swing sets and stuff like that. And this purpose is supposed to be implemented through activities that are reasonably related to the purpose, which sounds fine too. My point is that we have to look at politics and lobbying through this framework of C4s as exempt activities with their own exempt purpose. And we must think about what these words mean, promoting the welfare of the people of the community. And if we do that, I think we will find that the political money machines being built today on a C4 platform are not well designed to withstand scrutiny as tax-exempt entities. My second point, why don't we know about the first point already is the question under my second point. And partly it's, in a sense, the fault of all of us who write about this. Although I think my co-author Doug Mancino and I are now less free from blame than we were before, because the chapter in our book in the new supplement coming out this summer will move the C4 chapter from about 12 pages to, 50 plus or more, because we have taken a hard look at 501c4 and found several things that are very interesting. That the IRS has, over time, embraced the incoherence of Section 501c4 and has referred to it openly and rather pleasantly as a catch-all or even a dumping ground. It's where you put stuff you don't know what to do with. It's given itself a pass on coherence. And so here are some of the things we don't know about C4, but we need to know about C4. Does the IRS really mean it when it says social welfare is too complicated to explain or apply? They've actually said this. I think I'm going to argue that, in fact, they don't mean it, and yet they have been very happy to have this kind of flexibility, so they have a little safety valve in 501c. I'm now going to do something just earth-shaking. I'm going to somewhat question something Mark Owens says. This is never a good idea. This is just never good. But I'm going to do it anyway. I believe the IRS has been particularly incoherent about whether it treats lobbying as a permissible exempt activity of a C4, or whether, in fact, it's just pretended that it's done this. The only places it's ever said this are in its continuing professional education books, which, of course, all of us rely on because there hasn't been much. And then there are a series of revenue rulings. For any of you who want the cites, I've got the pages of the new treatise chapter here. I'll give you the cites, but I won't do it now. And what I've noticed is that in the CPE text, the continuing professional education text, they say, yes, it can be the primary activity, but the revenue rulings never quite say that. They say a substantial activity, and the only revenue ruling that says primary is for a 501c6 organization, which I am prepared to argue, if you're interested in questions, is a different breed of entity. And so I'm not sure that one can build a political money machine under C4 by doing some lobbying as your so-called primary activity and politicking as your secondary activity, because I think all you are is a purportedly tax-exempt lobby shop, and that may fail on a whole number of grounds. My third point of the havoc that has been caused by treating C4 as a catch-all is the service was reluctant until yesterday, actually, to address, and I actually mean that, yesterday, to address what is the primary purpose of a C4 and how do we think about it? There have been some vague statements about facts and circumstances, and that goes part of the way, but they haven't applied those to advocacy. Yesterday, they issued PLR 2012-24034, which I think you might want to read. It was apparently finished in March, issued yesterday, in which they do tell a purported C4 that it's not a C4 because it hasn't shown that it's operating primarily for the social welfare of the people of the community. The fourth area that we know nothing about is moving political money. And this is an easy way to buy a disclosure shield. You just move it into a C4 at some point, and then the C4 deploys it elsewhere, except we don't know whether that works. But in the midst of this technical muddle, the IRS has done one thing right. And if you read enough rulings and cases, what you will find is they have crafted a robust doctrine of structural private benefit that says a 501c4 may not provide direct benefits primarily to its members and contributors. Is this ringing any bells yet, people? It may not do this. If it does, it is not a 501c4 on private benefit grounds. And in the ruling from yesterday, they cite one of the older cases, Contract Plumbers, which has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with replacing the damage to streets by repairing plumbing under the streets. And I think that the long history of creating this doctrine of structural private benefit is going to allow the IRS, if they really want to move forward on challenging these organizations. My third point is that, in fact, the IRS before yesterday, when it talked about primary purpose, also applied a concept of private benefit in a series of 5-letter rulings relating to a campaign school for women candidates and leaders of a political party, and the IRS said that wasn't a C4 either. What do we take away from this? I take away the following. It's been 12 years since Congress has had any courage at all in the campaign finance area, really, when it looked at the new 527s that were then designed to collect and move money around willy-nilly without disclosing contributors. This would be a good year to rediscover a backbone in Congress. I've given up on the FEC, but we can't really give up on Congress if we want to not give up on democracy. And perhaps they could take a look at these C4s in light of what a C4 in fact is and raise some of these unanswered questions and tell the IRS to stop referring so happily to a C4 as a catch-all and try to tell us what a C4 really is.
Thanks, Fran. That's very, very good presentations, everybody. And maybe I'll, sort of try to kick things off with a question, and then we'll open it up to others. But I just picking up on that last point, I mean, for those of us who have been watching Congress lately, it seems kind of unlikely that Congress is going to be the one to jump in and fix this. And I'm just wondering if there are other things that could happen at the IRS that would make a difference in this area. Or one of my questions in trying to cover this is, how would we even know? I mean, there are some, you may mention some examples of things that may be significant. We don't really know if they're significant to other groups. But if they were, and if they're looking at some of these other groups, how would we even know that? And should we know that?
Well, we shouldn't know if they're auditing us. We wouldn't want that. We probably don't need to know whom they're auditing, because a lot of times the service will audit somebody and decide there isn't a problem. But let me be clear. I think that we got some clarity on campaign finance from an unlikely source. One of the most conservative judges of the D.C. Circuit in the Blumen case, which is the foreign residents properly registered resident aliens in the United States. And Judge Brent Kavanaugh, who was my classmate in the class of '84 of the Yale Law School, who I didn't know was so conservative then, but never mind. I knew he was really smart, and that's the thing that matters. So what he did in Blumen was said, look, campaign finance is not just about speech. Campaign finance is about speech and also about democracy, which is a breath of fresh air. And if it's about both of those things, then we have to think about all your questions of what we should know, and we should think about questions of when you're in the public square, engaged in in funding elections and speech relating to elections. Judge Kavanaugh just said, there may be times when foreign residents have all the rights that we do as citizens, but this is not one of them. This is an election because it's about both speech and elections. Now, that is not what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, and so we have, continuing uncertainty. Why do I have confidence in Congress? I don't, but it's the only Congress we have. The IRS can revoke exemption, but it cannot require disclosure. It doesn't have that authority.
I'd just like to step in here, and I don't mean to disturb Fran's bucolic view of Section 501c4, except to note that I did once rummage around in the dustbins of legislative history here. C4 has been around as long as the Internal Revenue Code has been around. It appears it was enacted at a suggestion from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which probably wasn't thinking about parks and swing sets, but in fact was looking for a broad category of tax exemption for those organizations that wouldn't fit within Section 501c3. In other words, the dustbin was the congressional intent in enacting Section 501c4, or at least one can make that argument. I should also note we all have strange law school classmates. Mine was Ken Starr, so.
I'm not sure Judge Kavanaugh is strange. I think I had many smart law school, and Ken Starr was. Look, that 1913 legislative history and the testimony of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is somewhat elusive because, of course, they weren't thinking about swing states and presidential elections. Back then, they didn't quite know what. They were talking in terms of civic. That was the language back then. But we have a long development going forward. I don't think I have a bucolic view of C4, but I think that C4s do something, and we've learned something over the years. And I think one of the things we've learned has been lost, which is the idea that structural private benefit really matters in the C4 context. And the IRS has been issuing rulings, and the courts have been deciding cases on this basis. And there is no reason we shouldn't apply this concept of structural private benefit in the advocacy area as well. It's easier in politics, I think, than lobbying, because who's the beneficiary? The candidate supported. We got that far, and that's not even hard. And so I think that if we just look at what the IRS has been doing, what the courts have been doing, it doesn't answer all the questions, and I've read out not even a whole list of the questions we have, but I don't think that Congress intended to have a dustbin. I think it intended something, and the regs, which of course have the force of a statute, tell us what that something is, and the development of the law since then has amplified that. It takes many forms, but being a tax-exempt lobby shop that supports candidates is probably not the most easily defended thing on the list.
Sorry, Mark.
No, I was just going to say, historically, 501c4s have looked like the Sierra Club or the National Rifle Association. In other words, they come together around an issue or a set of issues, and not quite the sort of almost political platform focus of some of the newer C4s that seem to be political organizations in a different set of clothes.
And a lot of the law comes from homeowners associations in developments, gated communities, and these arise when the developer no longer wants to own the common areas because the houses have sold, and then you have a homeowners association. And there's always been a requirement that if you want to be a C4, all those common areas have to be open to the public. Otherwise, you've got structural private benefit just for the members. You can't do that. Why can't you have tenants associations under C4s in a condo? Well, it's kind of hard to invite the public into your condo. We don't do that in Florida. Sometimes the public just arrives. We call the police. What those tenant associations ruling turn on can't be a C4 because there's no way to avoid structural private benefit in that setting. It goes on and on in C4, and so I'm not saying C4 is perfectly coherent, but there is this element of C4 that we've just lost that we need to start thinking about again. And so I'm not even going to apologize for those of you who use our treatise that the new chapter is so very long and has 427 footnotes, just so you can feel dismay and anticipation. And we'll go on forever, and we'll be updating it, you can bet, immediately.
I wanted to give Heidi a chance if you have anything to say on the question of the IRS or the things they should be doing differently, or what kind of job are they doing on this, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
Well, I guess I just want to make a comment about what Fran is talking about, and just the difficulties that arise when advising new clients as to what type of entity to set up. If they want to do more than insubstantial amount of lobbying, they can't become a 501c3, so they have to look at 501c4. If they're going to have, some clients say, well, we want to do political activity, so maybe we'll just form a 527 organization. Well, if you're going to do more than an insubstantial amount of lobbying, if you're a 527, you're going to be paying taxes on the lobbying that you're doing, because that's not an exempt function. So it raises some difficulties into what type of organization then you're almost forced to become a 501c4.
Maybe we're forced to point this out to Congress and tell them to pull up their socks and do their job. Just maybe a little coherent legislation in this area would not be really such heavy lifting. Maybe they should think about this. There are Congress, after all, and it doesn't seem unreasonable, because that's a real issue that Heidi's identified. And so maybe they should fix this rather than making Heidi do it.
I'm going to get up here so that I can see over here to see if there are questions over here. Celia, can you wait just a sec, because I think there's a microphone.
Celia Wexler, Union of Concerned Scientists, and so nice to see people I knew from Common Cause who are looking splendid. I wanted to get more clarification about the C5 and C6 designation. You know, you have trade associations, big ones, where members have conflicting positions, and that's sometimes even true for unions. So I'd like more clarity about that definition and how it applies. And also about, as you know, unions often take on rather large issues. The UAW was very involved in civil rights issues.
Well, I'll take a shot at answering that. The requirements for both C5 and C6 don't require the members to have similar political beliefs at all. And in fact, the concept suggests that their similarity goes to the occupation in which they're engaged, the business or the fact that they are an employee of a particular employer. In fact, C5s typically have to be certified by the Department of Labor as labor unions in order to be exempt. If they're decertified, they lose their tax-exempt status. And as for how you define whether a particular lobbying on a particular measure it has a nexus to their their membership's goals and purposes, either in a C5 or C6 context, I think the IRS is going to defer to management of the organization in making that determination. So it's, if it is questioned, the IRS is going to expect the organization to be able to show that, in the case of a labor union, the fact that a certain class of individuals, minorities, have difficulty getting jobs restricts the ability of the labor union to represent all the workers in collective bargaining in that particular employment relationship. And on the trade association side, you'll have a similar kind of broad interpretation of the relationship between, say, environmental laws and the Gravel Pit Owners Association wanting to lobby for a certain overlay of environmental restrictions, even though members may have different views on that.
Next question. Over here? Yeah, sorry. Somebody's over on that side.
Thank you. Mark Schmidt with the Roosevelt Institute. I just have a very small question. In the past life, when I've been on boards of some combined C3, C4 organizations, we were always advised that a significant limit to the use of a C4 was the possibility of the gift tax being imposed on donors to a C4. I'm just curious what the current thinking is about that complicated issue.
No comments, Professor?
I have comments, but
Well, the gift tax is a function of the Internal Revenue Code, and it places a tax on gifts of a certain value, with two statutory exceptions: gifts to charities and gifts to political organizations, the 527 organizations. And the IRS has taken the view in at least one revenue ruling and has prevailed in 3 court cases on the interpretation that those are the only exceptions from gift tax. That if I give you a gift of a significant amount of money, or I give a gift to a C4 of a significant amount of money, it triggers the gift tax. Now, that having been said, other than the 3 cases that were successfully litigated by the United States government, I might add, the government has not lost any cases on this point. Last summer, apparently last early spring and summer, a series of gift tax audits were opened up by the Internal Revenue Service of donors to 1 or more 501c4s. The fact of those gift tax audits became public. There was an enormous outpouring of concern expressed by Republican members of Congress to the IRS about this gift tax audit project. And as a result, in July of last year, July 2011, the Deputy Commissioner summarily closed those gift tax audits while they were in process, which, as far as I can tell, is a unique act by the Deputy Commissioner. Typically, they don't get involved in ongoing audits. It's one thing to weigh in on the technical decision. It's another to stop the process of investigation in its tracks. So the upshot is nobody knows
Could you
what the
explain
answer is.
what that would mean if, presumably a lot of people are not paying the gift tax on maybe very large donations to some of these groups, and what would it mean if somebody looked at that and said, maybe you should be paying the gift tax to the groups and to the people?
Well, as I say, the gift tax, the amount of the gift tax varies from year to year because it's it's tied into the estate tax, but it's triggered with a gift of a fairly significant amount of money. It relates to the estate planning the individual is undertaking, because if you've already set up a series of gifts to your children, for example, you have less of an exemption from gift tax than somebody who hasn't. So it's hard to actually come up with a percentage or number that's going to apply to any gift. But you can assume that gifts of $1 million or more are likely going to be subject to the gift tax. It can be substantial. In some years, it can be up to 40–50% of the amount you give. And if you're a wealthy person and you've given $10 million, $50 million, $100 million to a C4, you have a real potential exposure. And if the IRS was aggressively applying its published position and the position it prevailed on in 3 court cases, you'd probably need to hire a phalanx of lawyers to get ready to fight with the IRS over your $100 million gift, because that's enough money for the government to go to town on you.
One of the interesting questions is whether people who have paid the gift tax, and I understand some people have, are now going to go to the IRS and seek refunds on the theory that they have been, to be colloquial about it, they've just been punked by the IRS that says, we're going to keep your money, but everybody else doesn't have to pay for a while because we're on leave. We're just having a little hiatus from the gift tax. I don't know if anyone's done that yet. I don't think I should know if anyone has done that yet, but that would be an interesting case.
Interesting enough, the person in charge of IRS Public Affairs back last summer said that, when asked that very question, said that if refund claims were filed, there was no assurance they'd be processed favorably. So you may get different treatment.
Mm-hmm. I think we just have time for maybe one more. Go ahead. No, you, Mr. Curry? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Tom Curry with NBC Politics. Can you comment on, Heidi Abig, you mentioned the process of revoking the status of the C4. And in his, Senator Hatch sent a letter to the IRS commissioner this week saying, we have heard that the IRS is investigating some of these C4s, and then he raised the prospect of public release of donor information, which he said exposes citizens to possible harassment and intimidation. In the way the process is done, this investigation, if it's ongoing, it can be done without exposing donor names, correct? And are there cases in the past where social welfare organizations have been punished beyond just having their status revoked?
Well, Mark can chime in. I mean, I'm not aware of any donor names being released after revocation by the IRS.
Right, that's right. And in the application context, I think Senator Hatch does make a fair point. It's certainly unusual for the IRS to request donor names in the context of an application for exemption. The IRS has pretty broad latitude in requesting information that will help it clarify exactly what the activities of the organization that is applied are. And I guess it's conceivable that donor names might be part of that. There is a process, though, for redacting that favorable application. And once the application's been approved is the point at which it becomes a public record. And it is possible for the applicant or the IRS on its own initiative to redact information that has been submitted. There are specific authorizations for national security information, for trade secrets, and I have seen it used in my IRS experience with individual names. And things like addresses. For example, the physical address of a women's shelter is not something that you want in the public record. Post office box will do just fine. You don't need the physical address. I've seen the names of organizations that provide, scholarship funds to students, and the names of the students are volunteered by the organization. Those are redacted because that's not germane to the processing of the application. So, not having seen that application in which those questions were asked, it's hard to know if there was a nexus to the exempt status of that organization. But if there was, the IRS certainly has authority to ask. If there wasn't, and the IRS should have asked the question in a better way that didn't ask for names but asked for whatever it was that they felt was germane, there are procedures in place for redacting those names before it becomes part of the public record.
Okay, I'm going to step in here as the enforcer. Thanks very much to all of you for enlightening us on some of the tax issues that are being questioned a great deal, and it's a shame that the IRS couldn't chime in itself. But let's give a hand to our panel. Congressman Chris Van Hollen was elected to Congress in 2002 to represent Maryland's 8th District, quickly became a member of the Democratic leadership, and then 2 years ago became the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee. Roll call has noted that, quote, Van Hollen gets near universal respect from his colleagues for his intellectual firepower and combination of policy and political chops. He was instrumental in getting the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act through Congress, which requires more frequent and more extensive lobbying disclosure. He also is the sponsor of the Disclose Act, which, among other things, would require some of the 501c4s and other groups we've been talking about today to reveal the sources of their funds. And he also filed a lawsuit challenging the FEC for allowing groups running issue ads close to the election to not disclose who is funding those ads. He won the case at the district and appellate court levels. I'm sure he'll update us on what's going on with it now. Before his election to the House, Congressman Van Hollen served for years in the Maryland House of Delegates and for 8 years in the Maryland Senate. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College, the John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and the Georgetown University Law Center. He also happens to be my congressman. Welcome and thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased that even after redistricting, you're still a constituent in the state of Maryland. And let me thank the Center for Responsive Politics for organizing this very important forum today, focusing on the issues of transparency and accountability that go to the heart of our democracy. I also want to thank the work that you and OpenSecrets.org do in terms of tracking money in politics. As today's forum suggests, that's becoming increasingly difficult. And I think the focus of today's forum, which is the growing threat to the health of our democracy, of the huge amount of secret money that is spent to influence the outcome of federal elections, is something that we really need to focus on, and the American people need to understand very clearly what's going on. I'm sure there have been lots of discussions today about the different Supreme Court cases, but the two decisions, Citizens United and its offspring, Speech Now, took what I think was already a broken campaign finance system and made it worse. Those cases opened the floodgates to a gusher of special interest money from wealthy individuals, from corporations, and other entities. And I believe both those decisions were wrongly decided, but today I want to focus on the parts of those decisions with which I agree. Their reaffirmation of earlier Supreme Court rulings that disclosure requirements are important to our democracy and do not place an undue burden on free speech. Now, I wouldn't necessarily have spent as much time on the constitutionality and the public benefit of requiring the disclosure of the identities of individuals and corporations who are bankrolling TV ads to elect or defeat candidates. But since the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, last week launched an all-out political assault on the very idea and constitutionality of such disclosure, it is worth focusing on that issue for a little while. In his speech last week at AEI, Senator McConnell began a political attack on those who support greater transparency and disclosure in our election politics by arguing that the real goal of disclosure is to suppress political speech. Nothing could be further from the truth. Disclosure doesn't prevent any individual or any corporation or union from running a single political advertisement. It simply requires that voters be informed of who is financing those political advertisements. It is worth noting that the position Senator McConnell took last week represents a complete reversal from the position he took at the time he was fighting the campaign finance efforts of Senator McCain and Senator Feingold with respect to the 527 groups. At that time, Senator McConnell told Tim Russert on Meet the Press, and I quote, "Republicans are in favor of disclosure. If you're going to do that, and the Senate voted to do that, and I'm prepared to go down that road, then it needs to be meaningful disclosure. 527s are just a handful of groups. We need to have real disclosure. And so what we ought to do is broaden the disclosure to include at least labor unions and tax-exempt business associations and trial lawyers, so you include the major political players in America. Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? Senator McConnell asked. I agree with Senator McConnell. Back in 2000, yet in his speech last week at AEI, Senator McConnell tried to make the case that requiring the kind of disclosure he called for back in 2000 and requiring that donors disclose is an unconstitutional infringement of free speech, and he repeatedly invoked Justice Clarence Thomas's partial dissent in the Citizens United case, where Senator Thompson was the one justice who dissented from the portion of the Citizens United opinion that said not only was disclosure constitutional, but that it was an important public good. Indeed, the courts have expressly upheld disclosure requirements dating back to Buckley-Valeo, and those findings were reaffirmed in Citizens United and Speech Now. In Speech Now, the court said, and I quote, "The public has an interest in knowing who is speaking about a candidate and who is funding that speech, no matter whether the contributions were made toward administrative expenses or independent expenditures. Further, requiring disclosure of such information deters and helps expose violations of other campaign finance restrictions, such as those barring contributions from foreign corporations or individuals." So twin public goals: one, informing citizens; number two, ensuring that other campaign laws like those barring foreign contributions are not violated. Now, Senator McConnell argued last week that revealing the identities of these individuals would subject them to unfair criticism. He specifically mentioned the Koch brothers, who have spent millions of dollars trying to influence the outcome of elections as people that had been exposed to that kind of unfair criticism. I am sure that the Koch brothers, I'm sure that George Soros, I'm sure that others who want to spend lots of money to influence political elections, as is their right, and we should have a robust election debate with lots of points of views. I'm sure that sometimes people say things that hurt their feelings. But that is no reason why we should deprive American voters of their right, I believe, to have that information, and certainly the important public purpose that is served, as the Supreme Court has said, by voters having that information. Indeed, as Justice Scalia pointed out in the 2010 case of Doe v. Reed, there are already laws against threats and intimidation. He pointed that out very clearly. But he also observed that, and I quote, "Harsh criticism, short of unlawful action, is a price our people have traditionally been willing to pay for self-governance. Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed." That's Justice Scalia. So I found it a little curious that in his speech, Senator McConnell said that all these efforts to push for more disclosure were part of a radical left-wing agenda. The senator last week said, for example, that pressure from left-wing groups is making some corporations begin to notify their shareholders when those corporations are making political contributions. Heaven forbid that corporations should be asked to notify their shareholders, their owners, about the political contributions and political expenditures they're making. Hardly a left-wing idea. In fact, here's what Justice Scalia, Justice Alito, and the others in Citizens United had to say about that, and I quote, "With the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are, quote, in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests, unquote. Again, that's from the majority opinion, in fact, in Citizens United. I think it's very clear that the values of transparency and accountability are not some left-wing agenda. These are important American values. They're important to the health of our democracy. And that's why when you ask the American people, and you look at the surveys that have asked people about this issue, overwhelmingly, the American public supports the notion of transparency and disclosure. Republicans, Democrats, independents, people who are not affiliated with any party support that because they recognize it's important to a healthy democracy. And that's why in 2010, I and many of my colleagues introduced the Disclose Act in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives passed the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act required that these individuals, corporations, unions, others spending money to influence elections tell voters who is bankrolling their television ads and their other political advertisements. Very simple idea. That passed the House, as I said. Unfortunately, in September 2010, it was defeated in the Senate on a procedural motion. 59 out of the 100 senators supported the Disclose Act, but as everybody here who are close observers of Congress knows, in the Senate, in order to get a final vote on the bill, you need to overcome a filibuster. Republicans filibustered the Disclose Act. Senator McConnell led the Republicans in filibustering the Disclose Act. And because Ted Kennedy had died earlier that year, and he would have been the 60th vote, we only got 59 out of 100. Scott Brown voted against cloture, and therefore, even though the Disclose Act had a large majority in the Senate, it did not have enough to overcome filibuster and procedural delay. The reasons for the Disclose Act are more important today than ever. That's why we reintroduced the Disclose Act in the House. That's why Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has introduced the Disclose Act in the Senate. And the work of the Center for Responsive Politics shows that there's a growing need for the Disclose Act, because what we've seen in the aftermath of Citizens United and Speech Now is that the previous disclosure laws that we had are totally inadequate. They were inadequate before Citizens United and Speech Now, but the pressures created by those decisions in terms of the way people are contributing and making political expenditures has, in fact, highlighted the real weaknesses of our disclosure laws. So what you're finding now is that super PACs, while you hear a lot about them, are not going to be the vehicle of choice for a majority of the money that's going to flow into political elections. In fact, the studies that the Center of Responsive Politics and others show that in the 2010 elections, in fact, more money flowed into elections through 501c4s, 501c6s, than flowed through super PACs. Why? Because super PAC contributions are disclosed. The donors are disclosed to the public. It's not timely disclosure, and one of the things the Disclose Act would do is make those contributions to super PACs disclosed in a more timely manner, but disclosure ultimately happens through FEC reporting. But if you contribute to a 501c4 organization, for example, like Crossroads GPS, or any other C4 organization, or you contribute to the Chamber of Commerce, a 501c6 organization, those contributions are not made public. And what the data from the 2010 election shows is that more money, as I said, flowed into these elections through 501c4s and 501c6s. And in fact, the reasons been pretty clear, and if you go to the websites of a lot of organizations, they'll say right out there, you know, you do not have to have your contributions disclosed, so people who want to pump secret money into campaigns will use these groups as the vehicle of choice. Now, just in the last few weeks, there was a decision that came out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case was The Real Truth About Obama versus the FEC, and the court found that the FEC should apply what's called the primary purpose test to determine whether these organizations were, in fact, political organizations masquerading as educational and charitable organizations. And I think if you look at a lot of the public data, it's pretty clear that the primary purpose of a lot of these groups is to influence the outcome of the elections and for a very clear political purpose. And so this is an issue the FEC should look at. This is an issue that the IRS should look at to see whether or not these groups are abusing their tax status. Now, Senator McConnell says this is the administration is using the IRS as some kind of, a vehicle to go after its political opponents. That is a bunch of nonsense. What's happening is Senator McConnell is trying to pressure the IRS into not doing its job in revealing that some of these organizations are masquerading as educational charitable organizations, and they're being used for political purposes under the guise of educational and charitable organizations. And they're being used for that purpose because there are lots of people that want to hide their money in politics. So it's very important to look at that. The last point I want to make, and then I'm happy to try and answer any questions you've got, relates to the case that I brought against the FEC last year. And what the case we made was that the disclosure regulations that the FEC had put forward to comply with the statute on disclosure fell short of the requirements of the statute. In other words, the way the FEC interpreted the statute illegally narrowed the scope of what had to be disclosed when you run what are known as electioneering communication ads, EC ads, issue ads within certain time periods of primary elections and general elections. And the district court found in favor of our argument, and the Court of Appeals, the appellate court, denied a request for an injunction from the opponents of that. So that opinion and decision as of today stands. And that will put pressure on some of these groups that are using the guise of charitable educational organizations as a way to hide their political donations and expenditures. And the reason it will do that is what the court found was that these issue ads, which are often in the form of sham issue ads, this was, of course, a big part of the debate back during McCain-Feingold, that if these organizations now run those issue ads within the windows, the 60-day and 90-day windows, they will be required to disclose the source of financing. And the reason it will create some pressure for these organizations is that, by all accounts and by all the information we've been able to gather, those organizations have not been counting those expenditures on issue ads as political. They've been counting those under the umbrella of educational expenditures. So a lot of these hard-hitting issue ads aimed at trying to elect or defeat a candidate, but without specifically saying elect or defeat a candidate, have been put on the books of these organizations not as political expenditures, but as charitable educational expenditures. And to the extent that they now have to report those, they would then, they have to choose. Either they actually disclose them, they don't run them, or they switch to running harder hitting IE ads, which are very clearly political, and there's no question about whether or not they can be classified. I know it's a little complicated, but the bottom line here is that these organizations are doing all sorts of gymnastics to try to prevent voters from knowing the sources of their funding and prevent voters from knowing who is bankrolling those campaigns. And the proposition behind the Disclose Act is a very simple one. If you've got nothing to hide, you should have nothing to fear from transparency. As Justice Scalia said, our democracy is strengthened when all of us participate openly in the political process, and that when people are deciding to use money to try and influence voters' decisions in an election, voters have a right to know who's financing those, and there's a very important public interest and public good advanced by those disclosure requirements. And I'll just close by saying again, while I disagreed with lots of the parts of Citizens United and Speech Now, those courts by large majorities, in fact 8-1, upheld the idea that disclosure requirements are not only consistent with First Amendment rights, but they serve a very important purpose in strengthening our democracy. And I am confident that at the end of the day, we will prevail on this issue of transparency and disclosure because the American people overwhelmingly support it. People recognize that it's important to the health of our democracy. So the question is not whether we will prevail when it comes to transparency. The question is when, and that's a matter that's going to be left to the American people, but it is our responsibility, all of us who care about the health of our democracy, to help inform the American people about what's going on and what's at stake. So thank you very much for having me today. I'd be delighted to try and answer any questions you got.
If I could just remind everyone to state your name and affiliation when you ask your question, and we have our mic runners, so wait for the mic. Over there.
Sure.
You, yesterday, as I'm sure you know, President Obama's lawyer asked for the FTC, I believe, to check on Crossroads tax-exempt status. Do you believe that Priorities USA should also report its donors?
I believe all these organizations should be subject to disclosure. That's why I'm pushing for the Disclose Act, which would require all of them to disclose. And I think the FEC should determine whether or not these organizations are, in fact, political organizations or not. So, yeah, I think this should apply to all organizations. The FEC should look at them through the FEC's own two-pronged test that it's laid out. And that's what the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said the other day, that the FEC should determine whether or not these organizations are political organizations, which would require them to disclose just like super PACs have to disclose, or whether or not they're really educational and charitable organizations.
Jane? Wait 1 second.
Jane Mayer from the New Yorker magazine. Anyway, I just wanted to know what would it take, do you think, to get your legislation through Congress at this point?
Right.
And what reason is there to think it might? Do you need to change the bill in some way, or just change the makeup of the Congress, or pray for a miracle? I mean, what is it?
Right, all of the above. Well, maybe all of the above. No, let me thank you for the question. I hope that the Senate will take up the bill. I think that the more attention that's focused on the issue, the greater the chance that we will pass disclosure requirements because, as I said, it's clear the overwhelming majority of the American people support that. There's a majority in the Senate that's in favor of it, but as I indicated, you've got Senator McConnell and Republicans opposing it, even though they were for it before they were against it. And so in order to get it through the Senate, obviously we need to muster the political pressure from the American people to get it done. We're happy to look at any suggestions any of our colleagues have with respect to amending it, so long as it doesn't violate the primary purpose of disclosure. And then, of course, in the House, despite the fact that Speaker Boehner also has said that sunlight is the best disinfectant, there's no indication that the House Republican leadership will bring up the disclosed bill we passed. So our approach is to pursue a number of strategies. One is to keep up the political pressure in the House and the Senate, knowing that the Republicans oppose it, but also knowing that the American people support it. Number two, continue to pursue a legal strategy. As I indicated, the case that I brought against the FEC is now going to put more pressure on these groups to disclose. They're all looking hard for ways to avoid telling the American people who's financing their ads, but we will continue a legal strategy as well as we go forward. Yeah.
And I'm told you need to hold the mic close. So that
Eliza Newland Carney from Roll Call. Congressman Van Hollen, Republicans say the Disclose Act is uneven because it doesn't require disclosure from labor unions. Is that correct?
It's just not the case. If you look at the bill that we introduced in the Senate, if you look at the bill Sheldon Whitehouse has introduced, it applies across the board. There's no provision that says unions are exempted or anything like that. It's an argument that's a dated argument. There were some provisions that people pointed to in some of the earlier versions of Disclose Act that, while I disagreed with their characterization, I understood why they might try and make that argument. But that argument does not apply in any way to the bills that have been introduced. Yes.
Hi, Dan Frumkin from the Huffington Post. I was wondering, did you anticipate that the success of your lawsuit would result in what it did, which was basically these groups sort of thumbing their noses at you and saying, well, we'll just move the money from ECs to IEs or what have you? And at some point, do you think they've become too clever for their own good?
Well, I think they're already becoming too clever for their own good, and I think that you can see by the fact that they are submitting all sorts of questions to the FEC that they are trying to figure out their way through this thicket that they themselves have created by trying to take advantage of these charitable organizations, essentially, hijacking the form of an educational charitable organization for political purposes. With respect to the other part of your question, I don't want to get into all the details, but there were legal reasons that we had to pursue the FEC regulations regarding the electioneering communication statute before we could look at challenging their regulations with respect to the IE statute. I don't want to get into all the details, but as I indicated in response to the earlier question, it's part of an ongoing strategy. But I do believe that to the extent that people run IE ads instead of EC ads, and I apologize for people who are not initiated in all these areas, but to the extent that they do that, some groups will risk alienating their membership. So, for example, the Chamber of Commerce has said that it's determined not to disclose the sources of its funding for the campaign ads they run. Chamber of Commerce is one of the largest funders of political advertisements, one of the largest secret funders of political advertisements. They recognize, and most of their ads are run in the form of very hard-hitting issue ads. So their ads don't usually end with the words, elect Congressman X or defeat Congressman X. And they're usually in the form of these very hard-hitting issue ads, which have been in the past referred to sham issue ads as sham issue ads. But nevertheless, I think there are some members of the Chamber of Commerce who may become a little more uncomfortable when the Chamber can no longer argue that its ads are focused on issues that the Chamber cares about, but they're focused directly on the defeat or election of a particular candidate, because that then removes the thin veil of deniability that it's just purely a question of issues that the ads are dealing with.
I think we have time for just one more question, if there is one. How about in the back over here?
Congressman, on your disclose bill, how long do you think a group that's running, whether it's a genuine issue ad or a sham issue ad, how much of the advertisement, say if it's a radio ad, 15 or 30 seconds, should be spent on the disclaimer describing the organization running the ad?
Well, I'm not sure there has to be a set amount of time, but I think that it should be sufficient for the listener to know something about the organization. You put your finger on an issue which I think are one of the parts of the bill that could be amended but I stress without losing the importance of disclosing the identity of the organization. So I think disclosure is important enough that people who are running these ads can use a few seconds of their ads to tell people the name of the organization and some of the top funders of the organization.
The bill that you have actually has a disclaimer that runs about 20 seconds or more. And so I was wondering, on a 30-second ad, is there something that you would add to the bill to limit the number of seconds that would have to be used?
Well, I don't think the bill requires that it be 20 seconds worth of ads, worth of disclaimer. But I do think that we need to strike a balance, and I'm happy to sit down with any of our colleagues, Republican or Democrats, to deal with those kind of details. From Senator McConnell's speech the other day at AEI, it doesn't sound like he's interested in negotiating that kind of details. He apparently is fundamentally opposed to the idea that voters should be informed about who's paying for ads. So he not only has he's launched a full broadside against the issue, even though just 12 years ago he was the guy saying we need to disclose more, not less. So I'm happy to sit down with anybody who is interested in disclosure and transparency and making sure voters get that information, to talk to them about the best and most effective way of balancing different interests.
Could you just give us your name for...
David Keating, Center for Competitive Policy.
Great.
I'd be happy to sit down with you and explain the disclaimer in the bill and perhaps work with you to make it more affordable for groups that can't afford 1 minute long ads.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I wouldn't want to. I would be happy to sit down with the understanding that if we resolve that issue, the rest of the bill is fine. I mean, so anyway, I'm more than happy to sit down with anybody who's genuinely also interested in disclosure at the end of the day. Are you?
Certain types of disclosures, sure.
No, I mean, I know you're asking the questions, but since you asked me about working on a particular part of the bill, I mean, I would just ask you whether you think that the quote I gave from Scalia was correct.
It sounded like you quoted him properly.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I'm going to interpret that as you don't agree with the Scalia, all right? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Congressman Van Hollen. So
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, if I could just, I did want to just recognize and thank Karen Robb with my office. Those of you who work on these issues know that she's an important part of the effort. All right, thanks.
Kathleen Hall Jameson is director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania and a professor at the Annenberg School of Communication. She is a widely quoted expert on political communication, and she is the author or co-author of 16, count them, 16 books. This is a woman who gets things done, and I should know, I used to work for her at a wonderful organization called factcheck.org, which she co-founded. Now she started a new political literacy site called flaccheck.org, which uses parody and humor to debunk false political advertising. Kathleen and her team took a look at the accuracy of some of the ads being run by the 501c4 groups that we've been talking about in the last 6 months in the presidential election, and she's going to tell us what they found.
Thank you, Vivica. We know from academic work that's been done since the 1950s that people who assess messages use the source in that equation. That is, if you hear a speech delivered by someone who is identified as an expert on the prison system, or same speech delivered by a person who's identified as a student who just gathered up some information, or same speech by someone who's identified as someone who just escaped, you evaluate exactly the same content very differently. Source matters in judgment of messages. As a result, disclosure of source matters in judgment of messages. Secondly, we know historically that third-party advertising is overall, in the history of politics, both more attack-driven and more deceptive than candidate-sponsored advertising. So in 1996, the political parties' ads were more deceptive than the candidate-sponsored ads in the presidency. The issue advocacy ads have been historically, when compared to the party ads, more deceptive than the party ads. As you become more removed from the candidate and the tie between the two is severed, the level of attack tends to go up, as does the level of deception. Today, we are releasing the second of two reports on dollars spent on advertising by third-party groups. The first report on dollars spent by the top 4 spending super PACs, Iowa through Wisconsin, found that of the dollars spent on advertising, 57% were spent on an ad that contained at least one deception. That is, something ruled deceptive by one, and in general by more than one, usually by all of the 4 major fact-checking organizations. Today we report that of the top 4 spending C4 groups in the last 6 months, 85% of the dollars spent on presidential advertising, both of these are focusing only on ads about the presidency, are making claims about issues about the presidency. 85% of the dollars have been spent on ads containing at least one deception. Now, there is an error in the first sentence of the press release, so please ignore it. It actually understates the severity of the problem by saying it's 85% of the ads. It's not 85% of the ads, it's 85% of the dollars spent on ads contain at least one deception. And so you could have a whole lot of ads that aren't aired at all. They're aired for $2, and you could drop that denominator dramatically. 85% of the dollars spent on presidential advertising by the C4 groups in the last 6 months, the top 4 spending C4 groups, were spent on an ad containing at least one deception. Let us play our video, please.
Since December, 85% of the presidential ads released by the 4 top spending third-party groups known as 501c4s were found to be deceptive by fact-checking organizations including factcheck.org, PolitiFact, the Fact Checker at the Washington Post, or the Associated Press. Under IRS rules, a 501c4 operates only to promote social welfare to benefit the community. As long as it's organized primarily to promote the community's general welfare, it may lobby for legislation and participate in political campaigns. Federal tax law doesn't require 501c4s to disclose their donors. Therefore, the backers of these groups can remain anonymous. From December 1st, 2011 to June 1st, 2012, The 4 top spending 501c4s spent an estimated $24.9 million of their $29.3 million presidential ad dollars on ads containing deceptive attacks that included.
And Obama personally lobbied to kill a pipeline bringing oil from Canada. Obama opposed exploring for energy in Alaska.
And tens of millions of dollars to build traffic lights in China.
But his White House is full of Wall Street executives.
The 4 top spending 501c4s on presidential ads include American Energy Alliance, which champions free market energy policies, spent an estimated $3.3 million on deceptive presidential ads. Americans for Prosperity, founded by billionaire businessman and conservative activist David Koch to support lower taxes and limit government spending, spent an estimated $5 million on presidential ads containing deception. American Future Fund, a Republican-leaning group founded by longtime Iowa political operative Nick Ryan and headed by State Senator Sandra Griner, spent an estimated $6.4 million on deceptive presidential ads. And Crossroads GPS, a conservative public policy advocacy group advised by former Bush Lieutenant Karl Rove and former RNC Director Ed Gillespie, spent an estimated $10.3 million on deceptive presidential ads. The group is a companion organization to the super PAC American Crossroads. As of June 1st, no Democratic-leaning 501c4 had spent yet on advertising in the presidential race. To stop 501c4 groups and other third-party groups from polluting the airwaves with misleading ads, go to factcheck.org to email your local stations, urging them to insist on the accuracy of the third-party ads they choose to air.
Thank you.
Bob Bierzak is the moderator of our next panel. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Responsive Politics, and before he joined the center last year, he spent 30 years at the Federal Election Commission, where he served at various times as the commission's statistician, its press officer, and as a special assistant working to redesign the disclosure process. You can see why we like to have him around. He's also the co-editor of 2 books on campaign finance. He's a versatile guy, and we're taking full advantage of that at the center, where he's a wonderful resource to have around. And Bob will introduce the rest of our next panel.
Come up and join the table. As someone who, as you heard, has been trying to understand this process for now more than 30 years, and who I guess is on the record this morning as saying that we shouldn't assume that this is a system that's very coherent or makes a lot of sense, or words to that effect. What we're going to try to do in this short period is move from the sort of conceptual and overview of the tax law and the process, the structure of the process itself, to talk about some of the specific practical implications of this process and how it affects actors in the process going forward. We have 3 very distinguished panelists. I'm very grateful to have them with us. Their full bios are in your packets. I'm not going to elaborate so completely on their histories, but I will say that 2 of them are partners in very distinguished firms. And if you find, based on today's experience, that you feel like you need representation, maybe you can come to the panelists later. Paul Ryan is senior counsel at the Campaign Legal Center and has been involved in litigation and advocacy in the context of campaign reform for many years. Holly Shadler is a partner at Trister Ross Shadler & Gold. And Jason Torchinsky is a partner at Holtzman Vogel Josefiak. Please tell Tom I said hello. That's how old I am. I can remember when Tom Josefiak was Commissioner Josefiak at the FEC.
we're going to talk about, as I said, some of the practical implications, some of the phenomena, things that are happening today that represent the nexus of the tax law and the campaign finance law in its sort of practical application, and hopefully have a good discussion, as we did yesterday, about some of the implications of that. And we're going to start with Paul.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to center my remarks on what I consider to be two faulty assumptions that underlie the Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United that really led to a lot of this outside spending. First, that disclosure would provide citizens with the information needed to, quote, see whether elected officials are in the pocket of so-called money interests, close quote. And the second assumption of the Supreme Court, that these expenditures would be independent in a meaningful sense of the word, and therefore would not or could not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. First, with respect to disclosure, I think we have a real disclosure deficit. We've heard a lot about it already today. And with respect to these outside groups, the deficit is largely attributable to aspects of our independent expenditure disclosure rules, as well as aspects of our electioneering communications disclosure rules. Actually, I'll restate that. When it comes to the statute, or when it comes to independent expenditures, meaning express advocacy ads, ads that say vote for or vote against a particular candidate, part of the problem lies in the statute, part of the problem lies in the rules. When it comes to electioneering communications, the problem until very recently lie in the FEC's regulations, but as Representative Van Hollen explained, and as many of you already know, there's been litigation on that matter. I'm part of the legal team that represents Representative Van Hollen, challenging a 2007 FEC rule that created a disclosure deficit when it comes to the donors to groups that are paying for these ads. Now things are a little bit up in the air, but the statute language is broader and in my view is in force today and should be complied with. So first, with respect to express advocacy type ads, the statute requires the identification of each person who made a contribution in excess of $200 for the purpose of furthering an election or an independent expenditure. And then the regulation requires disclosure, identification of such persons who gave for the purpose of furthering the reported independent expenditure. In both instances, the only time the donor gets disclosed is if the donor gave the money to the spender for the purpose of furthering either, if you go by the statute, gave to the spender for the purposes of furthering independent expenditures generally, and if you go by the rule, which is even more narrow, gave for the purposes of furthering the specific ad that's disclosed on the report. The result, groups spend money on these independent expenditures, they generally do not disclose their donors, and they simply say, hey, no one gave us money for the purpose of furthering these ads, they just gave us money because they like us. Congress attempted to remedy this problem in the McCain-Feingold law with the electioneering communications disclosure, where the statute requires that a group that spends more than $10,000 on electioneering communication, meaning ads that clearly identify a candidate, broadcast ads that clearly identify a candidate within close proximity to an election, that they disclose the names and addresses of all contributors who contributed an aggregate of $1,000 or more to the person making the disbursement during the 2-year election cycle. The FEC in 2007, however, narrowed the scope of that rule pretty much to reflect the ineffective independent expenditure donor disclosure provisions by stating by rule that a corporation or union only has to name their donors. They only have to name each person who made a donation aggregating $1,000 or more for the purpose of furthering electioneering communications. And as soon as they adopted that rule in 2007, we saw a drop-off in groups paying for electioneering communications disclosing their donors. As Representative Van Hollen explained, he sued the FEC and won at the district court level. Now, we presumably have reinstated the statutory requirement that these C4s and other groups making payments for electioneering communications disclose all of their donors who give $1,000 or more. Second issue, independence of these expenditures. The reality is that the FEC's coordination rules, the FEC's rules define the term coordinated communication using a two-pronged test, both parts of which must be met in order for an ad to be covered by the rule and treated as a coordinated expenditure. The ad has to contain specific content, and the ad has to involve certain specified conduct. The candidate suggests or requests the ad or is materially involved in the spender's decisions regarding the ad's content or audience, etc. Some real concrete interaction there regarding the specifics of the ad. And in fact, under current law, an independent spender can be married to a candidate and share the same bed with a candidate every night without running afoul of the coordination rules, so long as they refrain from discussing the specifics of certain ad buys. That, in my view, is pretty ridiculous. The law also accommodates very close personal relationships between these so-called independent groups and outside spenders. The C4 Priorities USA and the Super PAC Priorities USA Action were co-founded by former Obama White House aides Bill Burton and Sean Sweeney. We've already heard about Restore Our Future was set up by several former Romney aides, including Charlie Spees, who served as his general counsel in 2008, Crossroads GPS and American Crossroads, co-founded by Karl Rove and Ed Gillespie, et cetera, et cetera. So the law accommodates these very close relationships. Finally, the FEC has interpreted federal law to allow candidates and office holders to attend and speak and be featured guests at fundraising events where unlimited money from individuals and corporations and unions are raised for these supposedly independent groups, so long as the candidate or office holder doesn't make the ask for the money. And if they do make an ask for the money, they just need to qualify and say, but I'm only asking for up to $5,000 and no corporate and union money. That's kind of awkward, so the reality is they show up and speak and don't even bother making the ask. So I'm going to stop there because I want to give some opportunity for Jason and Holly to respond and get this conversation going. But those are two major problems, I think, that undermine any notion in Citizens United decision that this money will be truly disclosed and that it will be truly spent independently of candidates.
Holly, I think you were going to discuss some of the problems that the groups themselves encounter in trying to deal with this environment.
That's right. I was asked to step away slightly from my role as lawyer and make some observations about the sort of more very practical aspects of addressing the regulatory environment. And I'll just introduce my brief remarks by saying that these are all my views. They don't reflect my clients' views at all. All observations that are entirely my own. I'll say three things about there is certainly a lot more to be said about the very practical day-to-day aspects of the regulatory environment now. But first is that there certainly have been a lot of changes over the last 2 years and even beyond that. And there's seismic changes. I mean, Citizens United and Speech Now are enormously important cases. But looked at a slightly different way, which is generally how I tend to look at things, not a lot has changed in some respects, because we do have we have replaced a lot of the so-called 527 spending, the groups that grew up from 1996 through the 2008 election. And those groups did a lot of election work, a lot of federal election work, and a lot of work that could not use magic words, but nevertheless made very poignant and pointed comments about candidates and their records, and educated people about the candidates. And those, over the course of the 1996 to 2008, of course, went through very different changes with respect to disclosure when they were required to start disclosing. But it looked at a different way. There is a case to be made that in some respects, the environment in which we are operating has not changed, because 527s were a very dominant force in elections, and now they have they've been replaced to a certain extent with super PACs and other types of entities. And that sort of leads into my second comment, which is I think the biggest challenge for organizations, small and large, is that the regulatory environment continues to be incredibly complex and very daunting. And you particularly see that in the never-ending changes that have taken place. I often start, when I'm training lawyers in this area of election law, saying that my first 10 to 12 years of practice, virtually nothing changed. It was a traditional PAC, and there were rules about disclosure, and there were all the contribution and best efforts and all of the rest of the rules. And then the area exploded, and there's just virtually not a week that goes by when there isn't a fairly significant change to be learned and sort of absorbed into the regulatory environment. So the next thing I would say is that I think the thing that's most challenging is not disclosure versus non-disclosure, super PAC versus 527. It's actually trying to keep up with the regulatory environment and the compliance systems of these organizations. The large ones are really challenged by the never-ending changes in the law, and the small groups are either falling by the wayside because they can't keep up with it, or inadvertently, I'm sure, being challenged to keep up with the regulatory environment and trying to stay up with it and comply with the rules. So that's a very challenging aspect that is worth further discussion. And then finally, just with respect to the Van Hollen case and the rules as we await the FEC's final rules for electioneering communications, I think one of the other real challenges is for particularly 501c3 organizations, but 501c4s and other C organizations that are very active in the policy arena and are facing the choice of disclosing all of their donors from January 1 from the preceding year to the current ads that they might be running. That's a big change, and it's one that all these groups have to work through and make a determination. Are they going to subject themselves to this rather far-extending disclosure, which they hadn't anticipated, or are they going to raise money for a segregated account, which is also permitted under the disclosure rules and still stands? And I'll just say one comment on those for the 501c3 organizations that might be addressing that issue, which is that they can raise money for a segregated account, but it may now raise issues under the tax rules that apply to them if they're going out and raising funds for a segregated account that's going to raise electioneering communication money, which could, by its name, suggest that it has something to do with the election. So I don't suggest that I fall on one side or the other. It's just that these are challenging times for nonprofit organizations to accommodate and continue to move forward in their activities. And I'll leave it at that.
Sure. I also want to make the same disclaimer that Holly made. I'm not here on behalf of any client or speaking for any client. The views I'm about to express are my personal views. I think I want to step back a little bit and say, why are we in this environment? We're in this environment because in the post-Watergate era, we decided that contribution limits, or Congress decided that contribution limits should be imposed on candidates and political parties. So moving forward, in 2002, you had the campaign finance reform community succeeded in their drive of essentially cutting off large dollars from the political party committees and wound up, in essence, driving those dollars elsewhere. Mitt Romney said it best, I think, during one of the debates when they asked him about something the super PACs were doing. And he said, look, I don't really want a super PAC. I'd rather be able to raise unlimited money into my campaign. And I think he said it out of frustration, but I think it's partially correct. Part of the reason that we have these outside groups is because candidates can't raise more than $2,500. Does anybody here know how much it costs to run a television ad in Los Angeles? One television ad? When you put candidates and party committees in the position where they can only raise limited dollars and everybody else can raise unlimited dollars, you put the parties and the candidates at a severe disadvantage. And it's the severe disadvantage that the parties and the candidates find themselves in that have led to the rise of all of these outside groups. And the other thing is, I think the speaker immediately before said, candidate ads tend to be more accurate and political party ads tend to be more accurate, at least by whatever standard they were using. The problem is candidates and the political party committees have a much longer term interest in having people like them and want to support them and their candidates for years and years and years and years than do the various outside groups that are out there on the right and the left, where their goal is either one particular policy issue or one particular election. And so if the money were still with the candidates and party committees, you'd probably see a totally different tone of speech. But yet the so-called campaign finance for reform community, who, by the way, don't disclose their donors, has pushed money away from candidates and party committees. And so when you push the money away from candidates and party committees, you push it to independent speakers. And I think the way the courts have approached this is essentially, hey, guess what? Politicians, you want to handcuff yourselves? You want to handcuff yourselves and your political parties? Great. We're going to let you, impose contribution limits on yourselves. But when you try to sort of restrict the free speech rights of others, that's where we're going to step in and say, enough is enough. And that's essentially what you saw happen in Speech Now and in Citizens United that has, kind of led us to the regime we're in today. Speaking specifically to the electioneering communications disclosure rules in the Van Hollen case, and in full disclosure, I'm representing one of the intervener defendants in that case, opposite of Van Hollen, one of the two seeking the appeal in the D.C. Circuit. When the Supreme Court signed off on the electioneering communications rules, it's very clear from the lower court decision and from the Supreme Court decision that the courts believed that they were signing off on something that was virtually identical to and parallel to the independent expenditure rules. And yet what you've got Congressman Van Hollen deciding, 2 years after his Disclose Act was, or a year and a half after his Disclose Act was defeated, suddenly he's determined that the statute that he enacted 10 years ago, or that was enacted 10 years ago, suddenly covers what he was trying to do a year and a half ago. And lost. And so I think what you're seeing is the campaign finance reform community trying to find a way to use the old law when everybody thought it meant something different to, and apply it today. I mean, when Congress passed the original electioneering communications law, corporations and labor organizations were flatly prohibited from making electioneering communications. I mean, transparency in this context is an attempt to silence people or intimidate people into not speaking. Why does Congressman Van Hollen want to hold those accountable who make contributions to groups that might air electioneering communications against him? Because he wants to discourage their speech. And if you look at what the effect of the district court decision was in March, there have been no electioneering communications made since the effective date of the district court decision, which was April 14th. Not a single one. So, while disclosure sounds nice and sounds like it's this panacea that everybody should be aiming for, I think what this drive for disclosure is actually doing is it's actually an attempt to silence people into not speaking or intimidate people into not speaking. And as Holly said, there are groups out there that are looking at this compliance regime and going, you know what? It's better for me to just keep my mouth shut rather than deal with the FEC. And that's what you're seeing happening as a practical effect of this drive for these disclosure rules.
I would love to respond first to the allegation that the so-called reform community does not disclose their donors. The Campaign Legal Center lists every donor of $200 or more on our website. We have long listed the names of all our donors. We have a couple of individuals, mostly foundations. We're not opposed to disclosing our own sources of funding, and we think it's a good thing to have disclosure of others who are even more directly involved in the electoral process. With respect to the Representative Van Hollen's lawsuit and whether this was ginned up to try to salvage a loss in the Disclose Act 2010, my view is that's completely ridiculous. The Campaign Legal Center and I in particular were closely involved in the 2007 rulemaking that led to this donor disclosure gutting regulation. We opposed it then. We still oppose it today. It's one of the reasons we're willing to serve on the legal team representing Representative Van Hollen to challenge it. We were not trying to salvage some loss from the Disclose Act. And the fact of the matter is that the statutory electioneering communication donor disclosure requirement that was gutted by the now invalidated 2007 rule was challenged in 2003. Its opponents had their day in court. It went to the Supreme Court in McConnell, and the Supreme Court upheld it. The Supreme Court has upheld it by a vote of 8-1, and again upheld the disclosure requirement in Citizens United, which I understand why Jason might argue, well, they thought they were upholding something different than the statute. They were upholding a regulation that rendered it ineffective. But the reality is we've had several Supreme Court decisions upholding by an 8-1 vote these electioneering communications donor disclosure requirements.
I just want to respond to one thing there real quick. Paul's group also supported the ban in 2002 on any corporation or labor organization making an electioneering communication in the first place. So let's start there. They didn't want anybody engaging in these communications. So let's start there with what they really wanted 10 years ago. It was the Supreme Court in 2010 that struck down that prohibition. In 2007, the court carved an as-applied loophole into it, which led to this ridiculous 11-factor test for what constitutes a true grassroots issue ad, which the Supreme Court then 3 years later in Citizens United struck down. So let's, when Paul says, oh, well, we were involved in the discussion over this regulation, they didn't want these groups speaking in the first place.
Okay, so we've practiced our oral arguments for the the upcoming consideration of that case. If I can, I want to go back to something that Holly talked about, and that is the difference between this environment and the environments we've seen before. Because I guess I kind of feel similarly about that, and we almost have a natural experiment for the concern you have about intimidation and for donors. In the 80s, the mid to late 80s, parties could raise soft money from any source for any with no restrictions or limitations, as long as it was used for non-federal purposes, and there was no disclosure of that. In the 90s, the Congress made a change that required the disclosure of soft money to the parties. And so I guess I would say, was there experience of intimidation or those kinds of problems after the disclosure took place that didn't exist before, as a specific question? And then more generally, what's different about this environment today, and why are those differences really important?
I don't recall any time in the 1990s that any reports or any cases or examples of incumbent politicians or organizations targeting donors to political parties because they made donations to political parties. I mean, look at what's happened to Aetna now that the fact that they've made contributions to 2 different organizations has come up in the last 2 weeks, has been made public. Aetna is getting all these calls for, basically a beheading because they made certain contributions. Look at, right now, I think around the corner, there's a march to protest outside of the Crossroads GPS offices, right, on New York Avenue around the corner. Well, why are they trying to do this? The whole goal here is intimidating. Why did the president put up this, basically enemies list on his campaign website about people who are contributing to his opponents? It's an attempt at essentially trying to intimidate people into not speaking. Why that was different in the 90s, I don't know. I mean, perhaps in some ways it's the advent of the internet and making it so that anybody anywhere in the country can instantaneously get this information. In the 1990s, it was a lot harder to get. If you wanted to know who made a contribution to the RNC or DNC, you had to trek over to the FEC and look on microfiche.
Not quite.
It was about that.
That's sensitive to me.
But I mean, but look, when did the FEC put the data online? 93, 94, maybe.
Yeah, a little before that. But I take your point. Yeah.
It wasn't as readily accessible, and then who could access it? Only people at universities. I mean, when you talk about the advent of the internet, I think the advent of the internet has made this a lot more real. I mean, if you think about it, the Prop 8 donors who lost their jobs, who had their businesses protested, well, how was that possible? It was possible because people took the donor lists and used computers and put them up on a map so that everybody could see exactly where supporters of Prop 8 lived and how much they gave and where they worked, because their employer and occupation was required to be disclosed.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. I am a strong advocate of increased and improved, strengthened disclosure, and I'm not interested in it to intimidate anyone. I'm interested in it to educate and to make real the words of Justice Scalia in his concurring opinion in Doe v. Reed that Representative Van Hollen read, the final paragraph of his concurring opinion in that case. If you haven't read it, I recommend that you do, because I won't restate it for you because Representative Van Hollen aptly did, but this is about civic courage and standing by your political convictions. If you're going to dump money into the process, if you're going to formally engage the political process, I think civic courage is essential to well-functioning democracy. There are a couple of cases out there pending in the courts that are considering this very question of whether or not disclosure requirements chill speech, particularly or specifically related to the Prop 8, California Prop 8. There's a case that's before the Ninth Circuit right now, the Cal Pro-Life case. There's another case out of Washington dealing with a very similar issue, Doe v. Reed, which already made it to the Supreme Court once on a facial challenge, and it may be on its way back to the Supreme Court on an as-applied challenge. There, the allegations are, if our names are disclosed, we are going to be harassed. There's a decades-long exemption in law, campaign finance law, and more broadly speaking in First Amendment jurisprudence, for compelled speech, an exemption from disclosure if those being compelled to disclose will suffer serious threats, harassments, or reprisals for their speech. The notion that the folks involved in Prop 8 would suffer such threats, harassments, and reprisals was flatly rejected by the District Court and then by the Ninth Circuit Court. A similar outcome was had in the Ninth Circuit, or in the District Court case, now back to the Ninth Circuit in the Washington State case, because the bar there what the case law developed, the historical record that that case law developed out of was NAACP v. Alabama, 1950s Alabama, where people were being lynched and attacked. That's the level of, that's where the bar is set for exemption here. The evidence in the case out of Washington, Doe v. Reed case, for example, was one of the collectors of signatures saying, I got mooned by somebody. Yard signs were stolen. And the courts to date have said, that's standard politics. That's what happens in politics. This isn't about you. This is about how people play politics. So, but the Supreme Court's probably going to have another crack at this in the next couple years in either the California case or the Doe case.
Let me just respond to that. I mean, I know that the disclosure activists keep wanting to quote Justice Scalia's concurrence in Doe v. Reed. Let's just put Doe v. Reed in context, though. Doe v. Reed was about a ballot initiative case where people were acting as citizen legislators. When legislators go to Richmond or Annapolis or come to Washington, they've got to put their name next to their vote. And essentially, that's what happened in Doe v. Reed. It was a case about signing signatures to put a piece of legislation on the ballot. So that's totally different than individuals privately associating with each other for the purpose of speaking. So the context, and I think the previous speaker keeps tagging things as deceptions. I would tag quoting Justice Scalia out of context in that case as a massive deception put forward by the disclosure advocates.
The one comment I would make about that is I do think that there is a distinction between ballot measures and groups that are engaged in a lot of different activities. And the one issue I would throw out there is in the case, let's say, for example, just applying the electioneering communications disclosure provisions now, where many, many people are giving to an organization with no thought of supporting an electioneering communication, not even necessarily supporting the organization's position on a particular policy in which they mention a legislator, but they have provided support to the organization for entirely different reasons. So in a ballot measure situation, you have a very specific goal you're trying to achieve, which is to pass a ballot measure, and presumably everybody knowingly gives for that purpose. But in the case of a much broader oriented organization, you do, putting aside intimidation and any sort of harm that might come to the person, you do have the question of whether associating somebody's name in a public document with an ad that they might not even have ever conceived of, known of, or even necessarily agree with the discussion in the ad. It does raise an interesting policy issue for consideration.
I just want to add one other real-life example. I went to the FEC with an advisory opinion request in May. I had a client who was running for Congress in Oklahoma. For a decade, he has owned his family's plumbing business. The plumbing business's name happens to be the same as his last name. He's been in every ad for the plumbing business for a decade. And we went to the FEC and said, well, if in the 30 days before his election he continues to be in his plumbing company ads, one, is that an electioneering communication? And two, under this district court ruling, is he going to have to disclose the names of every one of his customers from January 1 of last year who paid him more than $1,000? The FEC couldn't give us an answer. I mean, that's, this statute that was supposed to be so abundantly clear was so unclear that the FEC couldn't tell a guy whether he could keep running his business's ads for the last decade. And that's the kind of sort of hair splitting that people are trying to engage in when they're trying to figure out how this law affects them on a day-to-day basis, and we couldn't even get an answer out of the FEC. The plumbing company changed their ad. The candidate's wife is now in the ad for the plumbing company. No, they haven't. They've had the same ads up for essentially a decade, except now because of this ruling, they didn't. Because guess what? They didn't want to publish the names of every one of their customers from last year.
So somebody's watching for whether their sales go up because the wife is in the ads now. Some questions from the floor. Yeah, go ahead. Can you wait for a microphone? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel Marcus from the Center for Public Integrity. Mr. Ryan, you mentioned that the Supreme Court has upheld exemptions allowing groups who have faced threats or intimidation to be exempt from disclosing their donors. So is that a possible safety valve for some of your clients who you say would face threats or intimidation, or does that not apply to them?
I mean, one of the problems with seeking an exemption like that is you've got to go to the court and tell them who your donors are. I mean, how else do you seek the exemption? There's no group has successfully done it yet. I mean, I've had clients whose headquarters have been the subject of bomb threats. I've had other clients who've been the subject of very threatening, emails or voicemails where, to quote one, I mean, this guy left a voicemail for one of my clients after they ran an ad saying that, he's going to come find him and put a bullet in their brain. Well, how are you supposed to really just, it takes a lot to go to court with that kind of evidence and try to convince a court that, you really shouldn't have to disclose your donors when it's not really clear what the standard is. And then you open yourself up to all this discovery about who your donors are and what threats they might be facing. And you run the risk of disclosing information about your donors in the course of even seeking that judicial exemption. And then they're saying, if you want to exercise your free speech rights, your right to private association, you've got to go to court and get an exemption. It seems a little bit beyond what should happen under the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Keenan Steiner, reporter at the Sunlight Foundation. I think one of the things that I'm wondering about, Jason, is that I hear this argument from the folks on the right a lot of the time that everyone on the left just wants, if you just eliminated campaign limits, the contribution limits to candidates, that you wouldn't have all this outside money, and that it's the rules that limited that kind of hard money to candidates that has pushed the money to outside. And it sounds like revisionist history to me. I mean, it just sounds like what really made people go to outside money is simply in the most recent example is the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which made it so darn easy to actually do this kind of spending. It wasn't that somehow the limits to candidates pushed groups there. It's that the law opened it up for them to go there. So it just sounds to me like it's an argument just to use the latest legal sort of development in order to advance an argument you guys have had going for a long time.
I don't think that's the case. If you look at the late 90s when the party committees when both sides political parties had access to the unlimited dollars, you didn't see these massive outside groups. Where you saw the rise of the outside groups was post the 2002 McCain-Feingold law, where you essentially emasculated the political parties by cutting off their ability to have to raise large dollars. And it was post 2002 that you really saw these developments. And it wasn't just Citizens United. Go back to 2004. Look at Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. Look at the Media Fund. Look at America Coming Together. Look at what everybody started doing in the 2004 election, which was the first full election cycle after McCain-Feingold. The money, the large dollar shifted from the party committees to these outside groups, and it was the outside groups in 2004 and 2006 and 2008 until 2010, when you had the combination of Speech Now and Citizens United and the two FEC advisory opinions that led to the creation of the super PACs. I mean, it really was McCain-Feingold that caused the rise of the outside groups because they cut off money from political parties.
I just want to respond to that because I think it's important to remember the why. What the Supreme Court said about this money that was cut off by the McCain-Feingold law, and its McConnell decision relied on a very extensive district court record of corruption. The court found in 2003 in the McConnell decision that the ban on soft money to parties was constitutionally permissible because it prevents corruption. And the court has taken a step back from its notions of corruption in the Citizens United decision, but that's what this really gets down to. So do we want to return to a system of unlimited contributions to candidates and parties? Some certainly would, but it's going to come at a cost. If we go there, it's going to be a return to the corruption that was documented in the record that supported the enactment of the McCain-Feingold law and that supported the Supreme Court upholding that law as constitutional in McConnell.
Michael Beckel, also with the Center for Public Integrity. My question is about the coordination rules. Paul touched on this in his talk, saying that the court had a notion that these independent groups would be maybe more independent than we're seeing right now. And I think we've heard that Paul is troubled by this fact, but I was wondering, Jason, Holly, if either of you might be able to speak more about when you have super PACs essentially being outsourced media buying operations of campaigns. You've got donors who are maxing out to the candidates, being able to give more money to the super PACs, freeing up the hard money to be able to be spent on different purposes. Is that troubling? Do you think that the coordination rules need to be revisited at all?
I think it's government mandated disclosure that has led to the ease of what you seem to find some evil in. When you look at what the FCC rules require and what the FEC rules require, they essentially require that information about any television buys, any broadcast ad time that involves speech about public issues has to be made public. It's got to be maintained by the stations in their public file. The FCC is now driving to put it on the internet. And within 24 hours of the release of any communication that is an independent expenditure, you've got to file a report with the FEC. So, in the political world context, you have television stations that literally the minute like the DNC places a buy, they run to the RNC and they're like, hey, the DNC just placed a buy. If this were Coke and Pepsi, they don't do that with Coke and Pepsi because Coke would be really ticked off at them if they made public what they just bought. So you've got this mandated disclosure that makes tracking what everybody in the political sphere is doing. And again, here you've got disclosure, which everybody holds out as a panacea. In this context, people don't like it because it allows each party to see what the other party's doing, and so they match each other. And somehow, campaign finance reform advocates find some evil in that. And I don't think that's the problem. I think, again, problem is, all this government mandated disclosure has led to the ease of everybody knowing what everybody else is doing.
Okay. The arguments against disclosure for the outside groups, why would they not be the same? Why would there not be the same argument for disclosing contributions to candidates and parties, which has been accepted? I mean, somebody could be subject to harassment or some sort of problem from their employer, or who knows if they gave to a PAC or to a candidate that somebody else didn't like.
You haven't really seen it for party donors. I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that question. I'm not the harasser. So I don't really know.
It goes back to the point I was trying to make before, which is putting aside the harassment and the harm that might come to someone from taking a position and providing money to a particular entity. One of the issues that I think is very complex is requiring disclosure of funds and contributions to organizations that really have. If an organization spends, let's say, $100,000 and they have a $100 million budget, so they spend $100,000 on an ad and they have a $100 million budget, how do you determine what relationship that all of that disclosure of all of those donors of the $100 million, or even if it's $50 million, because some of it's from sales or whatever that wouldn't have to be disclosed, how do you determine what relationship that has to the $100,000 that was spent by the organization? So I just raised it as an issue of complexity, and it's a, there was the for the purpose of language in the electioneering communications provisions. They continue to be in the independent expenditure disclosure requirements, but it's a very complex policy issue of how you deal with organizations that have enormous budgets that are spending some fraction of those on policy, and how what relationship that donor disclosure has to that that policy activity.
And maybe just to add to that, maybe the difference with political parties is both political parties tend to be very big tent organizations where they've got people within the party who are on just about all sides of every issue. Now, granted, each party probably tilts more one direction than another, but there are, pro and anti-gay marriage Republicans. There are pro and anti-gay marriage Democrats. There are, you name an issue and you're going to find somebody from each political party on at least one side of the issue. And so maybe the difference is when somebody gives to a political party, they're giving to the broad-based political party. When somebody gives to, Planned Parenthood, they're giving or Planned Parenthood Action Fund, they're giving for a different reason. They're giving for a much more narrow reason. And maybe that's why, there's fear about donors who are giving to these more narrow groups, much less than there is to, fear from donors who are giving to sort of more broad-based political parties. I mean, that's just one theory, but I don't know if it's right or not.
Go ahead. I think this may be the last.
I'm Melanie Sloan with Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Jason, as the group that helped reveal Aetna's contributions to the American Action Network and the Chamber of Commerce, I'm unaware that anybody's actually called for anyone at Aetna's beheading, but I also am not even aware that Aetna has suffered any particularly severe consequence. But also I'd like to ask you why you think that they shouldn't suffer a consequence, and why is it that the people who pay their insurance premiums to Aetna don't have a right to know that Aetna is therefore using their insurance premiums to influence their votes?
I think when you have government regulating almost every industry in the country, the industries have a right to speak about why and how they're being regulated.
Can we squeeze in one more? Okay. Bob, do you want 2 seconds?
Anyway, I'm Bob Lenhart. I'm a lawyer in town, and a long time ago I worked at the FEC. I wanted to go back to the question Ken raised, Jason, because I think it raises a harder question. I mean, if the problem for C4, donors to C4s is intimidation, and that justifies non-disclosure of C4 contributions. And and consequently there's this undisclosed money. One of the solutions to that is to lift or eliminate the contribution limits for candidates and parties. It would seem that as those unlimited contributions begin to flow to candidates and parties, the risk of intimidation would return only in that context. And I think one of the reasons you don't see intimidation today is because there are contribution limits. The fact that somebody gave $2,000 to the Romney campaign does not generate the same kind of public attention as somebody giving $10 million to a super PAC. And I think if you migrate to a system where people are giving $10 and $20 million contributions directly to candidates, it would seem that intimidation problem would present itself again. And so I guess my question is, if one does migrate to that sort of a solution, doesn't it also bring with it a need to not have disclosure of contribution to candidate contributions?
You know, there's a really interesting proposal out there put forward by Bruce Kane, who's a professor from Berkeley, where he essentially has proposed a system of what he calls semi-disclosure. You know, kind of in like the census, where we don't reveal Census Bureau doesn't really reveal information about individual households, but they reveal kind of enough information to get kind of an aggregate sense of what's happening. I think he's got a fascinating proposal in that area. I mean, I'm looking at it in a little more detail, but I mean, I think there are some alternatives out there. I mean, the other difference with political parties is, even if you're a relatively large, I mean, look at a state like Virginia. Even if you're a big giver in Virginia, you're still one of lots of people who are giving, moderate-sized sums to candidates and political parties in the state of Virginia, and there almost becomes some self-limiting to that. In other words, you don't see, Corporation X writing a $10 million check to Bob McDonnell's gubernatorial campaign, even though they could legally. I mean, you just don't see it, and I think you would find some self-limiting from political parties based on kind of what everybody else is doing. And I think you would see that in the political party context and I'm not necessarily saying, lift all limits in all contexts, but $2,500 as a maximum donation to a candidate is really a small dollar amount when you consider what it costs to run a statewide Senate campaign or a national presidential campaign.
Thanks to our panelists for a lively discussion, hopefully illuminating too.
So while we finish getting set up here for our next panel, which is a larger panel, okay, I think to keep this thing running on time, I'm going to have to move on here. Our last panel's moderator, Jane Mayer, has been writing about politics and national security for The New Yorker since 1995 and has been a reporter in Washington for decades. She was the Wall Street Journal's first female White House correspondent. Jane is the author of the best-selling 2008 book, The Dark Side, the inside story of how the war on terror turned into a war on American ideals, and co-wrote 2 other bestsellers. She won the 2012 George Polk Award for magazine reporting and the 2012 Robin Toner Prize for political reporting. And Jane has made something of a specialty of illuminating pieces about important figures in campaign finance, including some that few readers had heard of, like Art Pope, and others that are more familiar, like the Koch brothers. And Jane will introduce the rest of our panel.
Just wondering if all of our panelists are here. Hi, how are you? It looks a little bit like the Seder table at Passover with the missing spot down at the far end. So we'll just hope that he shows up, Elijah shows up at some point. I don't know. Welcome, everybody. This is hopefully a panel with a lot of different points of view that can be good and feisty, as we've already seen already. So I'm going to start it with here comes Elijah. Come on down here, Tom Frank. So I'm going to start it with a question for everybody, and then I want the panelists to feel free to sort of jump in and talk to each other, and towards the end we'll take some questions from the audience also. So going alphabetically, from the far end of the table, we've got Tom Frank. He is the author of Pity the Billionaire and What's the Matter with Kansas and other books. He's the Easy Chair columnist for Harper's Magazine, whose most recent piece is about super PACs. And Tom wins the Precision Prize for submitting the shortest bio. Next to him, we have David Keating, who is the president of the Center for Competitive Politics and founder of SpeechNow.org, which won the lawsuit against the Federal Election Commission that created super PACs. Oops, sorry, I've got a dad in intensive care, so ignore my phone. We'll just hope he's okay. Prior to joining, I think he's all right. Prior to joining CCP, David Keating was executive director of the Club for Growth and executive vice president of the National Taxpayers Union. So he's a battle-scarred veteran and major protagonist in the campaign finance wars. Michael McLeod-Ball is the chief of staff and First Amendment counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington office, a free speech advocacy group that, like the Center for Competitive Politics, filed briefs on behalf of Citizens United. Mark Schmidt, on his left, is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute in New York. That is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his writing on American politics has appeared in The New Republic, The American Prospect, The New York Times, and many, many other publications. And previously, he was the director to Senator Bill Bradley and of his policy, and also a aide on Bradley's presidential campaign. And then we have Elizabeth Thompson, who is president of the Environmental Defense Action Fund and a director of congressional affairs at the Environmental Defense Fund. She's got extensive background in lobbying and working on issues ranging from climate change to the Farm Bill, and she describes herself as the anomaly on the panel. She says, I've not written on the topic, but I am a practitioner / victim of the process. So anyway, welcome everybody. And I guess just to ask a general question first, since we're looking forward on this panel, is campaign finance reform at this point, meaningful campaign finance reform, dead? If so, is that a good thing? If not, if it's not dead, what is the most likely form of it that is alive? Are we going to see enforcement actions from either the FEC, the IRS, or new rules from Congress? Or are we going to see a constitutional amendment? Or are we going to see public financing in the states or something else? Anyway, so where are we now? Are we dead or alive? Starting on my left, and and what's likely to happen next?
Yeah, I think that at the federal level, that any kind of action is nearly impossible. But as we've seen in the states, there's any number of states, depending upon their political leanings, that are willing to change laws. I would suggest that on the federal level, though, that what ought to happen is some tinkering around the edges that takes care of some of the problems that you've heard discussed in the previous panels today. And so, if the IRS can interpret its laws in a way that more fairly takes care of some of the issues that are raised before the IRS, that is something you might be able to see happen if there is an administration that continues in office that is open to those kind of new interpretations. But I think in terms of substantial change, the only thing that's likely at all is at the state level.
I agree with that. I think I've agreed with that for a long time, and I'm glad to be at a conference on this topic where, nobody said we need a constitutional amendment, which I think is one of the greatest distractions imaginable. Not to mention, I think even I would have some great discomfort about amending an amendment that does so directly affect the First Amendment. I think I'm a little worried from some of the conversation here about a little bit of an overemphasis on the value of disclosure as the solution that can happen. I mean, back in the day, before what Fred Hyatt called the bait and switch occurred, when the Republicans said, the solution to everything is disclosure, the old delay Doolittle alternative. I thought it was exaggerated. I think it's exaggerated now when we sort of grasp onto Doe v. Reed and some of these possibilities, again, to overstate the value of disclosure. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. I think it's really striking to me when I think about the Center for Responsive Politics and OpenSecrets.org, when I read Jane's work, just how much work needs to go into making disclosure actually meaningful to people in any way. I mean, just having, a massive database doesn't empower anybody as a citizen. It's the enormous work that needs to go into that. I was struck. I was saying to Jane in her article about Art Pope in North Carolina, the enormous resources that had been built up in the state of North Carolina to actually understand what was going on in there are really staggering and don't exist in a lot of other places. But I don't want to overstate disclosure. I also want to really draw out a point that it's not just about knowing who gave. There's another value here, and it's not quite corruption. I really like Larry Lessig's use of the term dependency, so that when you have, for example, a single large donor, whether they're using a C4 or a super PAC to support an individual candidate, that candidate is often very, very dependent on that donor. It's not simply that donor is speaking in some abstract sense. They are, for example, Sheldon Adelson kept Newt Gingrich's candidacy alive for a great length of time. The level of dependence there is exactly the kind of issue that people were concerned about in the early 1970s, and that's a value, when we think about what can be done, that's a value that I think ought to be part of it too. And where, again, state public financing, bringing more money into campaigns rather than pushing it outside, boosting the value of small contributions, the kind of thing that Mike Malbin and others have talked about in their Age of Network campaigns. That's where I think the future lies, rather than just disclosure or just reinforcing limits.
The only thing I would add to that is, I mean, I certainly think any legislative effort is dead for now and probably for a while at the federal level. And I don't think that's just campaign finance reform. I think that's most legislation. And I think people should presume that's going to be the case for 2013 and 14. So by necessity, you're going to have to look at other avenues for reform.
Well, I would say, I'm not sure what the word campaign finance reform means, but to me means things are getting better, not worse. Reform is supposed to make things better, not worse. And so I think things are getting better, but it's not because of anything the legislatures have done. It's what the courts have done. And as a result, we have more speech, which I think is good. Voters are getting more information, which I think is good. There's a lot of evidence that more information, more speech drives turnout, which probably also is good. And elections are getting more competitive, which I think most people would agree is a good thing. More incumbents are losing, which is probably also a good thing. We have new groups that specialize in just trying to get rid of incumbents in the primaries, which has never happened before, also a good thing. And I look back at, to me, when I was younger, one of the things that I thought was great, which was when Gene McCarthy ran against LBJ, and he made the crux, the focus of his campaign, a fight against the Vietnam War. And he couldn't have done it under today's laws, because basically his whole campaign was funded by about 5 rich people who gave the equivalent of about $10 million in today's money. So if we had the campaign finance system that we have today, there wouldn't have been an LBJ pulling out of a presidential primary. There wouldn't have been a Gene McCarthy, and we don't know what that would have meant for the anti-war movement. There's no one that could say what would have happened. So overall, I think campaign finance has been reformed primarily by the courts, and the reform is having some good effects right now.
Where do I think things are going? I think things are going to the 19th century. I think things are going to Bryan versus McKinley. Do y'all ever read that book, The Politicos, by Matthew Josephson? It's a history of political corruption in the 19th century, from the Grant administration up to the sort of the cumulative, the final iteration of this, which was this election between Bryan and McKinley. And you go back and read that book, and that's where we're going. It's very familiar. There's all sorts of references in it, to things that were, when he wrote the book in the 1930s, that were, obsolete, but have reappeared today. And that's the direction that we're going in. As I wrote the cover story for Harper's last month about how people are reacting to Citizens United and to your suit, which is in some ways was more momentous, the Speech Now suit. And what I discovered was that people by and large are pretty blasé about what's happening to us. And it started with this story that I read in the Kansas City Star. I was out there visiting my folks. And it was about Missouri becoming a red state. Missouri's always been a battleground state, but now Missouri's becoming a red state. And the way the Kansas City Star chose to describe this change, which is a pretty momentous change, was as the people of Missouri are going to miss out on the advertising dollars being spent by super PACs. That's how they framed it. And I thought, well, that's really strange. That's a strange way to do this. But as you look around, this is how sort of official consensus commentators always talk about these changes. Whether you're watching CNN and they have this chart saying, like, how much did they spend in Nevada, during the primaries? What did they spend it on? And the people of Nevada are really hurting. They could use some of that good campaign cash. The other thing I noticed was a really puerile form of mass media criticism. I was in graduate school in the 1990s, and cultural studies was the hot thing. I don't know if y'all remember this. I wrote my dissertation about the advertising industry in the 1960s, and all of the sort of debates that swirl back and forth about, advertising. Does advertising have an effect? Is it like all the metaphors that you come up with? Is it a conveyor belt, right? That just takes ideas from one person's head into everybody else's head? Is it just a big megaphone that makes you think like what the ad man wants you to think like, which is a sort of obsolete way of criticizing advertising? And then there's the modern way, or modern in the 1990s, where advertising was held to have no effect at all. It was just more information, and information is always good. And so the more the merrier, who cares? Incidentally, which is, well, we won't go there. But what intrigues me about what intrigued me about those arguments back then, and what intrigues me about the arguments today, is that they completely overlooked the structural way in which advertising expenditures change us. Okay, so what I did is I studied the advertising industry itself and how it changed and how it affected the larger culture, not how it propagandized people or something like that. And you can make the same argument about what's going on with Citizens United. Once you put such an enormous price tag on the office of the presidency or the U.S. Senate office or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter about the information anymore. You've made a larger change in the way the system works. To even get to first base in this system, you have to be billionaire friendly. So the content of the ads and all of this sort of advertising criticism, this mass media criticism that we're all having so much fun with, more information is always good, doesn't matter at all. What matters is the way that we've set up this new magnetic force, that we've completely distorted the way politics work. Although maybe it was distorted in the first place, last year or in the last couple of years, and the 19th century is the correct way, and that's where we're going back to.
You want to come right on in.
Yeah, I was just going to say I appreciate the reference to the 19th century, because I think the part of the 19th century that applies now has to do with this notion of independent expenditures, but that's just a phrase. The independent expenditures aren't truly independent, and so there was some discussion earlier today about how you might try to tighten up coordination rules in a way that would make the candidates responsible for the donations that they're receiving the benefit of, and they know that they're receiving the benefit of, the dependency notion that Mark was talking about. And nobody's really talked about that all that much. There are no legislative proposals in that particular area, and it's all regulatory, and as we know, the FEC is tied up in knots over how to proceed. And that sort of gets away from this idea of disclosure, because if you tighten up the coordination rules, you would essentially take that money that's going into independent expenditures and remove it from the process, because the contributions would then be limited to the $2,500 or whatever it is that each individual or organization is limited to when they're giving directly to a candidate, which is what they would be deemed to be doing if the expenditure were not classified as independent. So it's curious to me that there hasn't been more discussion about the sort of the faux nature of independent expenditures really being independent.
I just wanted to build on 2 points that David and Thomas were making, which, right now the Senate's debating the Farm Bill. It's a huge deal, at least in terms of a lot of impacts throughout the country, in terms of federal expenditures, environmental, and it's an incumbents game, right? It is entirely inside the Beltway. There's very little media attention to it. There's very little bit of discerning judgment being applied to it. And when I think about campaign finance reform, because Environmental Defense Fund, I mean, we're C3, and we have a little C4, and we actually are very issue-oriented. But to try to break through the noise and the din of all this money sloshing through the political system right now, and it just becomes white noise to average people, I think is a huge challenge. And I think part of what I haven't heard anyone really talk about is just, to a large degree, the disengagement of the American electorate on these core issues. And I think you're right. I think turnout's good. Getting more engagement is good, but I'm not sure having so much information and so much expensive media, people just entirely tune it out.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that in past years, I mean, the truism's always been that the American public doesn't care about campaign finance issues. That it's not a winning issue to make when you're in a campaign to say my opponent is, playing dirty and spending too much money, and it just doesn't work. And but it seemed to me that somehow this year there's some difference, and that because of the size of the donations and the way it worked in the Republican primaries, it almost became like this national sport that everyone was watching, where each of the billionaires had their own racehorse, and we were waiting to see sort of which one was going to finish first. And I went to a concert in Wolf Trap last week, and the performer said, it's great to be in Washington, the seat of the American election, or should I call it the American auction? And I think that there is kind of a growing sort of popular sense and kind of interest in the Moneyball aspect of the whole thing. Where that leads, I don't know. I don't know if, one of the questions I have is it going to make people more cynical, or is it going to make people more engaged, as Dave suggests? I don't really know, but I wanted to get a sense from you, all of you, whether you feel that that there's a worry, whether the worry is legitimate, that politics, at least at the presidential level and maybe in the states, is becoming more of a game of sort of billionaires, and that it might interfere with the idea of one man, one vote. And as David Keating was saying, this isn't new. It happened with McCarthy, and I think that's absolutely true. But it hasn't been the rule in every election, and it seems more so now. So I wonder, is this something to be legitimately concerned about? David, I guess.
Well, I'll answer that, but I did want to mention something about the rules on independent expenditures. I don't know how many people at this table, or even in earlier speakers that have spoken about it, have actually worked on a political campaign. The rules on independent expenditures and coordination are actually quite clear. Most of the people that work in this sphere, and I worked at it at Club for Growth, which ran independent expenditures through its PAC and now through its super PAC, we made it simple for ourselves. We just didn't talk to the candidate. We talked to the candidate to interview the candidate on their position on issues. We want to know, their background, their history, kind of their life story, and what they felt about on issues that we were concerned about. But we didn't ask, and we specifically tell them, we don't want information about your campaign. Don't call us. We'll call you if we have questions about your stands. And if you actually read the regulations, they are pretty tight. The idea that you could work for a candidate at some point in your life and then never work on a political campaign that might say something good about the candidate, I don't know if that's the proposal of Paul Ryan or not, but it seems to be implied by it. Now, as far as rich people and politics, look, we have rich people that do all kinds of things for our country. They donate a lot to charities. They build great museums. A lot of them just genuinely have strong beliefs about where the country should be going. Some rich people think it should be going in one direction that might agree with, say, the Environmental Defense Fund or the ACLU. Some others may agree with what Americans for Prosperity think. They see this as something to make our country better, and they want to put their money to that purpose. I think that's where most of this money is motivated. Now, yes, some companies probably do want to see policy change as well, and that's another form of money. But before we had this outlet for independent expenditures, unlimited amounts, we have a trend that I think is disturbing. And I have nothing against rich people. I like them donating money to my organization if they can afford it. But we have an increasing focus of the political parties is to get rich people to run for office, especially U.S. Senate, because they don't want to have to finance their campaigns. They want the rich person to finance the campaign. Now, a lot of rich people are self-made. They know what it's like to be middle class. They may know what it's like to be poor, but some of them don't. So I don't really see any difference between I think it would make more sense to allow the rich people to give money to a candidate who may actually be better qualified as a member of Congress than the rich person. And the parties should focus on recruiting the best candidates who will do the best job at representing their party's views, and then worrying about how to finance that instead of running around getting rich people to run for office.
This is like a greatest hits of the anti-campaign finance from the McCarthy. I've been for as long as I've been around this issue, which is about 15 years. I've been hearing about the McCarthy campaign and so forth. But it's also for as long as I've been around.
What other campaigns were missing because we haven't had them the ability to do this.
That may be.
Conservatives have to, they cite McCarthy and the liberals cite Scalia. It's just a sort of a.
It's a game. It's a game we
We've
play.
seen it.
It's a game we play. Yeah, and also in this time, I mean, it's definitely true, Jane, that I've never seen the level of actual public engagement with the issue. And it's sort of tragic that we have this level of public engagement at this issue at the very moment where we actually have the least to offer in response to it. And I find that very, very troubling. I think I want to, David's comments about the Club for Growth, those kinds of independent expenditures, I mean, I think really reveal a real distinctive. There's a world which, the world that Elizabeth works in, or Club for Growth, where you have traditional issue-oriented groups that then will, they might have a C4, it might have a small electoral role where it has its very clear viewpoint, and then it might do it might do any number of things that are intervention in the electoral process. That's very different from entities that are created entirely for the support of one candidate or one political party, that they don't, they're totally unrelated to any external position or viewpoint. And I think what's really important here is to begin to sharpen those lines. I mean, this is not just a battle about free speech, not free speech, corporate or other. Elections are a structured system. We have rules around elections. You have, for example, no electioneering within 75 feet of the polling place. That's a restriction on expression, but you don't want people in your face when you're walking from the place where you sign in to the polling booth. It's a very legitimate way of balancing some of these interests. That goes further. We also want candidates in the electoral context to avoid that kind of total dependency on a single or a couple interests. I don't even want to say donors, a couple interests. That's a legitimate public interest. The problem we're having is defining what's the boundary of an election or not, so that these things can get created that take the same form as a Club for Growth or EDF in the tax structure, but actually are simple electoral interventions. They're just straight up campaign contributions, and to the extent that there's a justification for some limit, it doesn't have to be $2,500. We could have a debate about where to set it. To the extent that we have some limit to reduce dependency on those direct contributions, we ought to have some kind of both disclosure and limits on those things that basically are exactly the same as direct contributions. But it's not that we're not. Partly, it's a hard problem because the world's a lot more communications is a lot more complicated, and so finding those boundaries around the election becomes tougher.
I agree with most of what you said. The original question was, are we concerned about the influx of all this money? And I would say no. I think the more people we have talking about political issues, the better it is. And so, it was just a few years ago that we were talking about how President Obama was getting all this huge number of small donors from his online operation. That's great. And to the extent that allowed the campaign to send out more messages, that's great. To the extent that there are more people giving more money to the political process and allowing for messages on political issues, I think that redounds to the benefit of the American public, because the American public then learns about the issues of the day and where the candidates stand on those issues. We do have some other issues, though, about disclosure, and I think you were touching on this indirectly in your last comments. This notion of the privacy of donors to organizations that are truly nonpartisan and are independent, but that want to speak on political issues. Why should those donors have to be disclosed? If one of the previous panelists in the previous sections talked about the NAACP case. Now, that wasn't really a political contributions kind of case, but think of just a couple of years ago, before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. If you had service members that were contributing to an organization trying to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, would that have risked their service in the armed forces? Well, we don't know, because it didn't really play out that way. But just because we're no longer in the time of the 1950s or 1960s when there was racial strife throughout the country, doesn't mean we don't have issues now where people want to retain their right to anonymous speech and to associate anonymously with others to try to change the political process. And I think that has to be also part of the discussion here if we're talking about where the system goes forward right now, because these changes, like in the Disclose Act, that would expand the electioneering communications period and would require organizations that simply mention a candidate's name in their advertising, would require those organizations to reveal their donors. And that would be organizations like the ACLU or like Planned Parenthood or like the National Rifle Association. And those organizations are entitled to keep their donor list private.
So we all have our personal interest in this, and as a member of the press, I am always in favor of more information about who's giving the money. So let me try to explain why and why I think it seems to me important in this context, which is that, as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, that what the Supreme Court cases, both Buckley and in Citizens United, didn't say that free speech should be 100% unlimited in the election context. What they said was it needs to be balanced against another interest, which is in keeping our democratic elections from becoming corrupt. And there is, I would think, somewhere, though, in my mind, and I wonder if I'm the only one on this panel who thinks this, a peril posed by unlimited spending from secret sources in our elections, especially since, as Tom suggests, that maybe advertising does have some effect on people. Otherwise, there must be some reason people are spending millions of dollars on it. So, am I the only one here who thinks that there might be a peril posed by the fact that, say, in 2010, what was it? Almost 94% of the money by the independent money was secret, and that maybe that this could pose a problem in terms of corruption? Wait, David, because you're definitely going to be on the other end of this one.
All right, well, first of all, we have an enormous amount of money that's spent on elections that's totally secret, and everyone supports it. Probably everyone in this room. That is the news media. The news media is allowed to run stories of any kind it wants. It's allowed to run unlimited amounts of editorials on who should be elected. That works pretty well.
Why is it secret? I mean, anybody who
It's
wants
secret because we don't know the advertisers and the
the
editorials.
advertisements are in there for anyone to inspect, and at the New York Times every month they put out a list of how much they spend.
It's not disclosed how much money is spent on the advertising in these publications.
It's not a secret.
Yes, it is. It's not reported to the FEC.
It's not to the FEC, but it's printed in publications like Ad Age.
Well, this is like the plumber case. They're paying for an advertisement. They're not paying to support a political intervention.
Well, we don't know any of this. We don't know the discussions. No, people are giggling about this, but we don't know this, and we don't. And I'm not saying it exists, but I'm saying is the First Amendment protects the free speech, okay? Protects free speech, it protects the media. If you look at the wording of the First Amendment, there really isn't any special carve-out that's more for the press than for individuals getting together and publishing.
But isn't the press also subject to the same balancing act in terms of corruption? I mean, nobody has suggested that the press is corrupting the election process, but if they are, I suppose we'd be just as
there are
worrisome.
organizations that exist now on both left and right that critique things such as Fox, and then there's right-wing groups that critique things such as NBC and so on. No, I'm just making the point that there is a lot of spending on elections that's not disclosed. I support this, but the spending that's done by organizations, if it mentions a candidate within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary, all that spending is currently disclosed. If it is for an independent expenditure, all that spending is currently disclosed. If it's for an independent expenditure, it has to be disclosed no more than 48 hours after the spending is done. The debate is about whether people have donated for these expenditures or not, and at what level of disclosure there should be for donors to organizations that make these expenditures. So, for example, if the Sierra Club were to make an endorsement of a candidate and run an advertisement saying Sierra Club is backing this candidate, some people think that means the Sierra Club should have to disclose every single donor. Others think, no, Sierra Club is just spending it out of its budget because it wants to say something about this candidate. And that's the range of view on this. My view is the Sierra Club wants to say they endorsed a candidate and they're doing it out of their general budget, they should be able to do that. But in terms of the protections that we have for individuals and groups, I see them on the same plane as the media. I support the media being able to sell advertisements. I support the media being able to decide their own news coverage and to decide their own editorials. But why should we not allow individual people to get together and publish things the same way? I don't see the difference.
Well, I didn't want to turn it shouldn't be a debate on what we all think, but really a kind of a look at where we are going. And I guess one of the questions that is in front of the public is whether or not disclosure efforts will move forward. I don't know what you all think the prospects of that. Or if you think that there might instead be some other kind of effort that would move forward in terms of, for instance, policing the 501c4s and maybe examining them to make sure that they are in line with the stated purpose under the IRS code.
I'll jump in on the issue of disclosure. I think, as I said before, I think nothing is likely in the near term unless there was some sort of little tweak around the edges that the Obama administration might try to achieve administratively. But I think the principles are well enough in focus that I can envision in some future year that there would be some further trend toward greater transparency. But I think there needs to be a discussion about what kind of disclosure is appropriate, what kind of disclosure helps to advance toward that court-stated justification of preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption. And so I would say that for organizations that are truly independent, that are not partisan, that are not intending to support or oppose particular candidates in their attempts to get elected, I think it's much harder to make the case that there is corruption, the possibility of corruption or the appearance of corruption. And so if the National Rifle Association wants to run an ad about a new piece of legislation dealing with semi-automatic weapons, the National Rifle Association ought to be able to do that without having to disclose a single one of their donors. Same thing is true for the ACLU or the Planned Parenthood. Organizations across the political spectrum ought to be able to engage in their issue advocacy, their true issue advocacy and not their sham issue advocacy, without having to disclose their donors. That kind of privacy needs to be maintained. That being said, if there is that connection, though, if there is that connection of an effective direct contribution to a candidate, to a candidate's candidacy, then I think it gets harder to avoid the fact that justification might exist.
I think I basically agree with that. I mean, to go to your original question, Jane, I mean, I don't think the difference between secret billionaires and not secret billionaires is the only thing that matters in the world. I mean, really, billionaires making huge electoral interventions are an issue, and often you have the information about who they are, but you don't know anything about actually what their interests. I mean, it takes a lot of work to find out why they might have given, and even then, there might be any number of reasons that an individual might give, or that an action might be taken later that might benefit that individual. So disclosure alone is really not the solution. I think that the discussion at the beginning of this day, which was fairly technical but very helpful for somebody like me, really is the key. I mean, the use of C4s, and I think what Professor Hill had to say was very useful. I mean, the use of C4s is as at least as dramatic as Citizens United and Speech Now put together, and it's created a world in which I read a piece. I think it might have been in National Journal, it might have been Eliza's piece, saying lots of groups were now thinking that they needed to get into be much more engaged in the elections, and I think that I like the world in which there are C3s which do what C3s do. Like Center for Responsive Politics, there are C4s that do lobbying and maybe touch on politics in the way they relate, and then there's the political electoral world. And we had and obviously some of the legal distinctions were kind of murky and assumed, I guess, was part of what I took away from the first section. But it's a useful set of distinctions to begin to draw, and that there are regulations and disclosure requirements and other things that we put into this political world that we don't necessarily put over into this C4 and C3 world. And the fact that all those distinctions are being blown up before our eyes is to me maybe it sounds a little wonky, but I think that's going to be very consequential and something that can be addressed, actually.
Now, does anyone imagine that the Supreme Court might be moving in a different direction in the future, either that there would be more justices joining Justice Thomas in his basically skepticism about or opposition to disclosure, or some other movement? I remember Justice Ginsburg recently made some comments when in connection with the Montana case that's coming up, where she said, I think we need to kind of reconsider Citizens United. And one law professor, Rick Hazen, said he thought that at some point the court would reverse itself on that, and most other people said that's not likely. But I wonder, do any of you see the Supreme Court changing position on any of these issues?
Nobody else will talk. I'll talk. I don't want to predict what the Supreme Court will do, but I would say with regard to the Montana case, that's centered on relying on the presumed connection on this notion of corruption and contributions to candidates, and so to the extent that rests on a particular fact pattern in Montana, and then is depending upon which way the decision might go, that it seems to me that kind of reanalysis of the fact pattern is at least a possibility. But I can't imagine that the court, having made its decision in Citizens United, would reverse field. Also, I would suggest that most of what we've talked about today has nothing to do with Citizens United. We're not talking about corporations being involved in this process. We've been talking about the influx of big money, and we know from the limited reports we've seen over the past few years that most of that money is coming from individuals and not from corporations.
Well, we've looked a little bit at the history in Montana, and there is no history that would justify that particular law at all. The courts, to the extent they cited anything at all in Montana, they cited direct bribery cases and nothing with respect to corporate independent speech had anything to do with anything. It was actually a ballot initiative that passed in the early 1900s that had 26 different provisions in it, and this was just one of them. So I don't see the court looking at the history of Montana. It's nothing special. And it's not even relevant to the case, so I don't see them overturning it.
So maybe it's a good time to take some questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question out there? Okay, here's starting right here.
The premise of the day, to some extent, has been the disclosure.
Oh, do you want to say who you are also? I'm sorry.
Bob Weinberger from the Aspen Institute. The premise of the day has been that disclosure has some important public benefits, that sunlight is a disinfectant. I would argue that it really hasn't been much of a disinfectant in the current environment, that corruption flourishes in plain sight. But my question is, if you're designing, are there any regulations or restrictions or rules of the road that you think could be applied to the campaign finance or political finance world that would be useful and that would make the system better?
You asking me or all of us? Well, I think to the extent we can encourage more speech, it's a good thing. That's why I think the court decisions we've seen lately are a good thing. One, to me, interesting development was an advisory opinion that was recently approved by the Federal Election Commission that actually expands the use of secret donations to candidates through the form of text messaging. And I thought this was fascinating because many of the groups that weighed in were saying, yes, let's do it. And I actually believe that part of the problem right now that we have today in encouraging small donors is to to encourage them to donate, because I think some of them are concerned about their own privacy, especially in this tough economic environment where it may be hard to get or keep a job. The disclosure for giving to candidates has been fixed at $200. So when you give that amount in an election, then it becomes public. That's been fixed since 1979. Now, back in 1979, when you gave $200, that was real money. In today's dollars, it would be about $630, $650 before it would become public. Second, it would only become public off in some filing cabinet at the FEC. Today, if you're looking at a job applicant, you can just Google a person's name and see their entire political contributions. And if I were from Idaho and I were a left-wing giving Democrat, I'm not sure I'd want that known to some of these right-wing Republicans who run big companies in Idaho. So I think we should take a look at increasing the threshold for disclosure of small donors. I think it would encourage more donors to step forward and give money to candidates of their choice, and I think that would be a good thing. So I hope this is something that a future Congress can look at, and I think given the interesting set of groups that came out in favor of the text messaging non-disclosure of donations, perhaps other people would think that that might be a good thing too. Maybe Michael Malbon will do a study on it.
Yeah, I actually think that's a very promising avenue. I think that the disclosure of the $200 donors, I mean, part of it, the most popular site after the Center for Responsive Politics for looking up information a couple years ago, and they've kind of changed it, was the one where you could look at a map of your neighborhood and find all the donors. And it was very fun. I like in my neighborhood because it's very curious. A lot of people in my neighborhood give to both parties. I must live around a lot of lobbyists. And they no longer do that anymore. You now can just get it by zip code, and that's probably a very good development. But I think if there's a promising angle, a trade-off of disclosure, a little less disclosure for relatively small donors, and in exchange for real disclosure of big donors would be, if such an arrangement could be discussed, would be brilliant. And then I think also the most important thing is, as David says, get more money and more speech by actually encouraging and boosting small donors. Lifting some of those disclosure requirements might be one way to boost small donors, but something like the New York City matching fund system, which is now, under consideration in New York State, partly because lots of people who were elected under that system to the New York City Council, now part of the legislature, they know it can work. They know how many more people are actually involved, as Michael's studies have showed, in states that have systems like that, or localities that have systems like that, as opposed to those that don't. I mean, I think as more and more people see how that works, it can be something that feels right for politicians, feels right for donors, and makes the system overall more fair. I remember being in Arizona when Janet Napolitano was governor, and I remember her describing that system there in that state, which is not quite matching system. It's more of a clean money system. But I remember her saying that people qualify by getting a $10 contribution. I remember her saying the genius of it is I can go to the same people that I ask for votes and ask them for money, as opposed to asking these people for votes one day and then I'm in a law firm conference room the next day asking those people for money. When you can bring those things together, there's a huge value in that.
I think there are a number of things that can be done. First of all, I think it starts with some kind of a public financing system. The Fair Elections Now Act is one proposal that I've seen that we're generally in favor of. We haven't come out in favor of it, but there's a lot of pieces of that we like. And similar kinds of systems have been adopted in a number of states around the country. I think we do need to sort of redefine what constitutes a truly independent expenditure. We have to redefine the coordination rules so that independent expenditures that aren't truly independent are counted as contributions to the candidates. And then also, there's something that nobody's talked about recently, and that's a matter of giving free airtime to candidates in the course of the election. I think that's another thing that could sort of alter the equation.
Kathleen?
Television stations have the right to insist on the accuracy of third-party ads they air, or they can reject them outright if they'd like. Do you see an advantage to the system if they were to exercise that right aggressively, or do you see a downside?
I mean, I think television stations are going to be very reluctant to exercise that right outside of the most egregious cases.
They basically want the money. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And if they can see some documentation that covers their rears, you know, they'll probably run the ad. So interestingly enough, the candidates' stations are required to run the ad, no matter what it says, no matter true or how false it is. So, you know, I think that the best answer for that is more debate, more ads, and you can have ads hitting the other ads. In fact, you often do see that.
And I would just say that the thing we don't want is government deciding what can run and what can't run.
I should add to that, there are actually a number of states that do have such laws requiring truth in political campaign advertising. And of course, one of these laws was recently struck down a few weeks ago in Montana, but many of them exist. And in Ohio, there's an actual Ohio Elections Commission composed of, I consider, basically 6 or 7 hacks. I forget exactly how many. And they're in charge of deciding whether something is true or false. And usually the complaints are filed very close to the election, where there's just enough time for the commission to announce it's investigating the truthfulness of the ad, which is then used by the candidate who is the subject of the ad, saying the other guy is running an ad that's under investigation. And then, of course, it isn't until after the election that the truth or falsity of the ads comes out. So I very much agree with Michael's comments. We don't want the government deciding what's true and what's false. Let's have more robust public debate. These private organizations, the fact-check type groups, that's the way to go about it.
Over there, you. Oh, okay, and then you. You're right behind each other.
Michael Beckel from the Center for Public Integrity. At a couple points today, we've talked about, or panelists have mentioned, issue ads versus sham issue ads. And I was wondering if you might be able to say more about how the government might differentiate between issue ads and sham issue ads, and what the pitfalls of that might be.
Well, that's the big, that's the last 10 years in a nutshell, right? I mean, there was a huge amount of research, huge resources put into really showing, for example, that people didn't see the difference, you know, between an ad that said, call your congressman and ask him why he always raises taxes, and one that said, don't vote, you know, vote against your congressman, all those things. Huge textual analysis of some of those, which really, that was the factual record that led the Supreme Court to uphold the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Act in 2002, and it was a level of factual record that had never been there in Buckley Vallejo, and really wasn't there at all. There was nothing similar to that factual record in the issue as the Citizens United case was expanded beyond the original questions. So you know, so that solution of naming a candidate within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of an election became the de facto, the best you could do of identifying the distinction between a sham issue ad and a real issue ad. It's not perfect, but that's kind of what we've wound up with. But maybe we need something a little more sophisticated about how you do that. Maybe it's related to the kind of entity that's actually paying for the ad. Does the entity have does it have a broader set of interests, or is it really just a campaign entity?
Okay.
Well, this is an extremely difficult question, and the original bill, as Jonathan Torchinsky noted earlier, the solution was not to allow groups to run ads of any kind within 60 days of a general election, and this is a huge problem because most of the legislation that passes Congress. You know, Congress is a procrastinating body, okay? They stay in session in September of an election year and often into October of an election year. A lot of very critical legislation comes up for a vote then. A lot of genuine issue ads, however that might be defined, is going to come up then. But it's not just what's before Congress. It's what's going to be in the next Congress. And what better way to influence what would come up in the next Congress than to push candidates really hard during the campaign season when everyone's paying attention to take a position or switch their position. And one way to get them to switch their position is to put a lot of heat on them on some issue that your group disagrees with until they cry uncle, and decide, well, maybe I should take a stand in this direction, or maybe they've avoided taking a stand. So this is an extremely difficult question. I think the solution is, of course, just to allow more speech about this. And I think the place to draw the line, the place where the court drew the line correctly in the Buckley case, was if it covers express advocacy, then it's covered. If it doesn't, then it's not. And to me, that's the best place to draw the line.
Okay.
So focusing on the going forward aspect, John McCain recently said something about how a scandal is basically inevitable in the current system. So to what extent does the limited disclosure system make it difficult for a scandal to even be uncovered? And then also, if there's a scandal, then what? What are the chances of serious finance reform happening? And do you see any chance of this becoming a very serious election issue in the 2012 presidential or congressional campaigns?
From where?
Republic Report.
Okay.
Just on the last point, I think there are those who would like to make this an issue in the campaign. There are these groups that are organizing around the country on demanding a constitutional amendment to reform the First Amendment, and I think ultimately that will all fail. But I think it's being used as an organizing tool to try to gin up support, if you will, for those who are particularly engaged on that issue, or who feel as though the Citizens United decision reflects some corporate takeover of America that I think we sort of concede that has not happened, at least among, except for the point that was originally made by the speaker down at the end of the panel, in a larger sense. But my answer to that is, I don't think it's a big issue really ultimately this year, other than just as a tool.
Right. I mean, it's certainly a bigger issue than it's been in a long time. And we'll see where that goes. I mean, I'm sure there'll be some sort of scandal. I mean, the problem is you have no idea what it's going to be like, what it'll look like, and whether it will actually be some scandals actually tell you something about the system, and some are just outliers breaking a lot of laws. So when people are breaking a lot of laws, they don't always help you think about changing the law, but sometimes there is an indirect effect. I mean, certainly in Connecticut, when Governor Rowland went to jail, and it wasn't, he broke a lot, he had people paying for his home repairs and classic kind of corruption. Somehow that fed back into the creation of a good public financing system, even though that wasn't a direct answer to the scandal. But I think sometimes, they do focus attention on issues in a way, but some scandals don't. I mean, the Abramoff scandal didn't lead to anything particularly constructive, partly because it was often, maybe it did lead to this obsessive focus on lobbying, which is almost over the top now, in the level of restrictions on lobbying. Maybe it did that, and some ways a scandal sometimes leads you in the wrong direction. It leads you to address that particular problem rather than the broader problems outside of the scandal itself.
I guess my answer would be that the history of campaign finance has been partly a history of scandal and then correction, and then usually unintended consequences discovered in the corrections, and then, but most recently I think that there's been a kind of a phenomenon of what one person I was reading described as frozen scandals, meaning that the scandals don't necessarily bring the usual kind of outrage and reform that cycle that we've seen in the past, and part of it is because Congress really has to act usually in order to make reform take place, and there's been a kind of a frozen aspect up there, fewer kind of serious investigations that are bipartisan. It takes usually bipartisan action, and so I don't know if I think it's a good question. If we have a scandal with something, would there be reform or not? I don't know. Anyway, but so did you want me to take one more question? Is there any other question out there that anybody's got, or should we?
Yeah, there's somebody.
Oh, I can't see that over there.
Maybe at the end of this conference we can do one thing, which is maybe put to rest the canard about the McCarthy campaign. I'd really like to know if anybody on the panel doesn't believe that in this age of internet fundraising and with the strength of the anti-war movement, that Gene McCarthy couldn't have launched a candidacy with a lot of small donors and not needed those millionaires. And, you know, the other thing that I'd like to say is that I resent the fact that my vote does not count as much as a billionaire's vote. And I hope that we don't lose track of that kind of sentiment, that democracy doesn't work very well when the big donors have the megaphones and everybody else is left virtually silent. And thanks very much to all of you for coming.
This sounds like a question from me. And this isn't working, right? That's cool. That's what I deserve. But you know, we've been talking about, you know, more speech. More speech is always better. More information is always better, and that's, you know, that's true in a general sense. But you look at what's happening to us, and you're talking about more speech, but speech that's, you know, more speech that's billionaire friendly, more information, only information that's billionaire friendly. Maybe I'm the only, you know, person in this room that I do a lot of speaking or typing anyways, you know, First Amendment, right? I write for a magazine. I don't like billionaires. I don't like their ideas. I don't want them choosing our, you know, our candidates for us. Sorry, I forgot to eat today. And I think that we're all, you know, we're whistling past the graveyard. We are becoming a plutocracy. Okay, the word isn't a joke anymore. You know, we need to resurrect it from the 19th century. We need to remember what it means. We need to remember what it looks like, because that's what we're becoming. And you can say, yes, but Tom, we'll always have a two-party system, and we will. And we have conservative billionaires and we have liberal billionaires, and it's true. But if you go back and look at the way President Obama describes his campaign donors in his memoir, what's his memoir called? The Audacity of Nope, right? Or whatever the hell it is. Where he describes the people that funded his campaign. You know, and they're liberal, very wealthy liberal people. But they're always, you know, you read his description of them. I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me, but it's very telling, right? They're very good on culture war issues, of course, right? Very liberal on culture war issues. They can't stand organized labor. They love NAFTA. They love free trade. That's my liberals. All right. And they, you know, they think that the free markets and the, you know, better education for everybody, that's the solution to all the problems that ail us. That's the liberal billionaires, okay? So between them and the conservative billionaires, the stuff I believe in doesn't have anybody to pay for it. It doesn't have any money behind it. So I listen to us talk about what can be done about all these things. You know, I'm sorry, I'm not a lawyer, I don't study this issue, but it seems obvious to me that the only answer to these things is to build a movement that's not a billionaire's movement, okay? A movement of average people.
But it will need to be funded.
Not by billionaires.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for this great panel discussion, and thanks everybody for coming.
It's wonderful to both air all the issues with a lot of erudite explanation, as well as to see some of that passion. So thanks to all of you for joining us, and to our great speakers for sharing their wisdom and views, and to our audience for their interest and insightful questions. I'd like to offer special thanks to our staff for putting together today's event. First and foremost, thanks to our talented editorial and communications director, Viveka Novak, who coordinated this conference, and to fellow communications staffers, reporter Russ Choma, who is probably welcoming his first child into the world right now, and outreach coordinator Eva McKinder. Additional special thanks to assistant Philip Zanders, who made sure we had an audience and that they had things to eat or food to eat and things to read. And we'll be posting the video as soon as possible for those who want to relive the moment or check to see if they heard what they thought they heard. And finally, I want to announce that we have, perhaps moments ago, or maybe a little bit ago, just integrated the 990s contribution data discussed in our Shadow Money Trail series into our outside spending profiles at opensecrets.org, so check that out. Otherwise, please join us on social media and sign up for our weekly newsletter to stay in touch and up to date on the money trail. Thank you all.